My parents ignored me every Christmas until I bought a mansion. They came with a locksmith and fake papers to take it. They did not know I had filled the dark house with police and reporters waiting for them to break down the door. My name is Savannah, and at 33 years old, I finally learned that the best way to handle a toxic family is to let their own greed destroy them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was December 15th, and the holiday rush at the international airport was absolutely deafening. I stood near gate 24, gripping the handle of my worn leather overnight bag, while holiday music blared over the public address system. A few feet away, my mother Patricia was adjusting her expensive designer scarf and complaining about the crowd. My father Richard was checking his gold watch with an expression of intense impatience. Next to them stood my younger sister Chelsea and her husband Brandon, who were already pointing excitedly toward the entrance of the exclusive first-class lounge. We were supposed to be going on a family ski trip to Aspen. It was a trip I had been told to clear my schedule for months in advance. Instead, Patricia turned to face me with a look of mild inconvenience. She reached into her pristine leather handbag and pulled out a single crisp $50 bill. She held it out to me with a casual shrug that communicated exactly how little I mattered to her. "We only had enough airline miles for 5 tickets to Aspen," she said, her voice completely devoid of any guilt or hesitation. "You understand how these things go, Savannah. Just take a cab home and do not forget to feed the dogs while we are away." I stared at the green bill fluttering between her manicured fingers. I had blocked out 2 entire weeks of my incredibly busy schedule for this trip. I had packed my bags and driven them all to the airport in the freezing early morning hours, and now I was being dismissed like the hired help. Chelsea let out a sharp laugh and looked down at my simple black travel bag. "Plus, your thrift store luggage is kind of embarrassing us right now," she said loudly enough for the people in the adjacent boarding line to hear. "Aspen is a luxury destination, Savannah. You really do not fit the aesthetic. Maybe next year you can save up enough from your little side hustles to buy a regular coach ticket." Brandon chuckled, wrapping an arm around Chelsea and steering her toward the VIP lounge. My father did not even look at me. He just grabbed his sleek silver suitcase and followed them. "See you in 2 weeks," Richard called over his shoulder. "Keep the heat turned down at the house so the bill does not get too high." I stood completely frozen in the middle of the terminal, watching my own family walk away from me. For a moment, the noise of the airport seemed to fade into a dull hum. Any other daughter might have broken down in tears right there at gate 24. Any other person might have begged them to stay or felt crushed by the sheer humiliation of a public discard. But I did not cry. I was far too used to this treatment. I thought back to just a few weeks ago when my father had humiliated me in our childhood home. I had brought over an expensive espresso machine as an early holiday gift, trying to do something nice. Patricia had literally pushed the heavy box off the kitchen counter, claiming they did not have the space for my cheap apartment gadgets. In that exact same breath, Richard had proudly handed Chelsea the keys and a signed deed to a brand new luxury SUV, casually boasting that he had taken out a second mortgage just to pay for it. When I had tried to gently warn them about the insane interest rates on that kind of loan, Richard had turned vicious. He told me not to lecture him on finance just because I flip rundown shacks for a living. He called me a spinster renting a shoebox and a total disappointment to the family image. They truly believed I was a struggling failure who could barely afford rent. They had absolutely no idea who I actually was. As they disappeared into the first-class lounge, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I ignored the $50 bill Patricia had tried to press into my hand, letting it fall to the terminal floor. I opened my email app and clicked on a message I had received from my escrow attorney just 10 minutes prior. The subject line read simply, "Transaction complete." I opened the message and stared at the digital confirmation. The massive wire transfer had cleared the bank without a single issue. I did not go back to my parents' house to feed their dogs. I was not going to play their dutiful, unpaid maid while they sipped champagne in the snow. Instead, I called the most exclusive premium pet boarding service in the county. I paid upfront for 2 weeks in their luxury dog suite, complete with heated floors and personalized gourmet meals. I arranged for their specialized transport van to pick the dogs up from the house immediately. I loved those dogs, and I was going to make sure they had a better Christmas vacation than anyone else in my family. Then I walked out of the airport into the freezing winter air and hailed a premium black car service. I gave the driver an address on the wealthiest historic side of town. My family thought my business was a pathetic side hustle. They thought I painted old cabinets and laid cheap carpet in terrible neighborhoods. The truth was that I was one of the most successful and discreet luxury real estate stagers and developers in the region. I took properties that regular developers were too terrified to touch, elevated them with world-class design, and sold them to international buyers for massive margins. I kept my wealth entirely quiet. I drove a reliable older car and wore comfortable, simple clothes because I preferred to let my bank accounts speak for themselves. I had built an empire completely under their noses while they drowned themselves in high-interest debt just to look rich. The black car rolled through the winding, snow-covered streets of the historic district. We passed massive estates and towering pine trees until we finally pulled up to a set of towering wrought iron gates. The driver stopped, looking back at me in the rearview mirror. "Miss, this is a private estate," he said. "I know," I replied, stepping out into the snow. I paid the driver generously and walked up to the heavy metal gates. This was the Hawthorne Estate. It was a sprawling, magnificent 15,000 square foot architectural masterpiece built in the late 1800s. It sat on 4 acres of pristine manicured land, featuring a carriage house, an indoor pool wing, and towering stone chimneys. It was listed at $5.2 million. Patricia and Chelsea had been absolutely obsessed with this mansion for decades. They used to drive past these very gates and fantasize about being invited inside for high society charity balls. They considered it the ultimate symbol of wealth and power in our state. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy ring of antique brass keys. I slid the largest key into the gate lock and turned it. The heavy iron swung open smoothly. I had not just closed a deal on a new project today. I had purchased the Hawthorne Estate entirely in cash. It was completely mine-free and clear. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway, feeling the satisfying crunch of fresh snow beneath my boots. The mansion loomed above me, beautiful and quiet in the winter afternoon. I unlocked the massive solid mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The interior was breathtaking. Double sweeping marble staircases framed a massive 3-tiered crystal chandelier that hung from a vaulted painted ceiling. The light caught the intricate details of the historical woodwork. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of expensive floor wax and old money. I walked slowly through the empty, echoing halls, running my hand along the cold, smooth marble banisters. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I was standing in the very house my mother and sister viewed as their ultimate unattainable fantasy, and I owned every single inch of it. I had earned this through years of relentless, exhausting work, while they spent their energy tearing me down. I sat down on the bottom step of the grand staircase, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. The house was cold, but I did not mind. I pulled out my phone and opened my social media apps. Sure enough, Chelsea had already posted an update. It was a perfectly filtered, smug selfie of her and Patricia holding champagne flutes inside the first-class airplane cabin. The caption below the photo read, "Family is everything. So sad Savannah could not afford to join us this year, but we are ready for Aspen." I stared at the screen, letting the sheer arrogance of her words wash over me. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I opened our family group chat, which included Patricia, Richard, Chelsea, and Brandon. I lifted my phone, angling the camera so that the magnificent sweeping marble staircases and the glittering crystal chandelier of the Hawthorne Estate were perfectly visible in the background. I held up the heavy ring of antique brass keys right in front of the lens. I snapped the photo, making sure I looked completely relaxed and unbothered. I attached the image to the family group chat and typed a simple reply. "No worries at all. I was busy closing on my new house anyway." Enjoy Aspen. I hit send. I locked my phone and set it down on the marble step beside me, listening to the profound silence of my new mansion. The war had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea what they had just started. 3 days of absolute silence felt like a lifetime of healing. Savannah spent her mornings walking the vast, echoing halls of the Hawthorne estate, carrying a mug of black coffee and a clipboard. She was already visualizing the complex restorations. The grand ballroom needed the original hardwood floors meticulously refinished, and the massive crystal chandeliers required specialized cleaning. Her high-end contractors were scheduled to arrive in exactly 48 hours to begin the structural assessments. For the first time in her entire life, she felt completely in control of her own destiny. That delicate serenity shattered precisely at noon. The heavy brass intercom panel mounted on the kitchen wall let out a harsh, piercing buzz. Savannah frowned and set her clipboard down, pressing the video monitor button. There on the small pixelated screen stood Patricia and Chelsea. They were bundled in extravagant fur-lined ski coats, shivering angrily outside the wrought iron gates. The Aspen trip was supposed to last 2 full weeks, but clearly the sheer humiliation of Savannah's text message had dragged them back early. They looked less like family members dropping by for a casual visit and more like an invading army preparing for a siege. Savannah considered leaving them out in the freezing December wind. But she knew Patricia well enough to know she would simply start screaming at the neighbors and causing a massive public scene. Savannah pressed the release button and watched the heavy iron gates slowly swing inward. A black luxury SUV tore up the long, snow-dusted driveway, kicking up gravel and slush, before coming to an abrupt halt near the frozen marble fountain. Savannah pulled her heavy cardigan tight across her chest and stepped out onto the sprawling stone porch. She closed the massive mahogany front door firmly behind her, making sure the heavy latch clicked into place. She intended to keep this conversation exactly where it belonged, outside in the freezing cold. Chelsea jumped out of the passenger seat first, her face red with a mixture of winter chill and pure, unadulterated indignation. Patricia followed closely behind, practically vibrating with entitlement. Neither of them said hello. Neither of them offered a single word of congratulations to Savannah on purchasing the most coveted piece of real estate in the entire county. Instead, Patricia marched directly up the stone steps, her designer boots clicking sharply against the ice. "Move out of the way, Savannah." Patricia commanded, her tone dripping with the exact same dismissive authority she had used at the airport terminal just days prior. Before Savannah could react, Patricia shoved her shoulder hard enough to force her aside, grabbing the heavy brass door handle and pushing her way into the grand foyer. Savannah followed them inside, her jaw clenching as the freezing winter air rushed into her pristine home. Patricia stood in the dead center of the entryway, slowly rotating to take in the sheer magnitude of the historical estate. Her eyes scanned the sweeping double marble staircases, the hand-painted vaulted ceilings, and the intricate antique woodwork lining the walls. The jealousy radiating from her was a palpable force in the room, but it was instantly masked by a terrifying level of deeply ingrained delusion. "This is absolutely perfect," Patricia announced, her voice echoing loudly off the polished marble floors. "Richard has been desperate for a venue to host his business partners for the annual New Year Gala. The country club was completely booked, but this massive space will do nicely. I will need to bring in my own decorators, of course. Your taste is far too austere for an event of this caliber, and we cannot have our guests thinking we live in a museum." Chelsea was already wandering toward the east wing, peering through the grand archways with a greedy glint in her eyes. "I saw a carriage house out back when we pulled into the driveway," Chelsea said, pointing a manicured finger toward the rear floor-to-ceiling windows. "Brandon and I will take that. The main house is entirely too drafty for my seasonal allergies, but the carriage house looks cozy enough once we completely gut the interior and modernize it. And Mom, you should definitely take the master wing upstairs. We can knock down that historical wall and turn the connecting library into your custom walk-in closet." It is the only logical way to set up the house. They were dividing up her home like spoils of war. They genuinely believed that Savannah's money and Savannah's ultimate triumph belonged to the family collective to be distributed according to Patricia's whims. Savannah walked calmly past Chelsea and planted her feet firmly at the base of the grand staircase, physically blocking her mother from taking a single step higher into the private areas of the house. "Nobody is taking anything," Savannah said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that demanded immediate attention. "You are not hosting a corporate gala here. You are not moving your furniture into the master wing. And Chelsea is absolutely not gutting my carriage house. I live here alone. This is my property, and every single inch of this house is completely off limits to you." Patricia stopped, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "Do not be ridiculous, Savannah. You are a single woman with no husband and no prospects. What on earth are you going to do with 15,000 square feet of empty space? It is entirely selfish to hoard a massive property like this when your family has actual important social obligations to fulfill in this town. We are your family, and we share our successes. That is how this works." "We share our successes," Savannah repeated, feeling a dark, bitter laugh rising in her chest. "You mean like how we shared the luxury trip to Aspen? You handed me a $50 bill and told me to feed your dogs. You literally abandoned me at the airport terminal 3 days ago because I was not worth the cost of an airline ticket. You only care about sharing when I am the one holding the keys to something you want." Chelsea stomped her foot on the marble floor, throwing a full-blown tantrum that echoed terribly in the vast space. "You are so unbelievably ungrateful," she screamed, her voice shrill and accusatory. "You owe us, Savannah. Do you have any idea what Mom and Dad sacrificed for you over the years? When you graduated college with your useless design degree, they let you live in our basement for an entire month rent-free. We fed you. We put up with your depressing presence while you figured out your pathetic little side hustles. You owe this family everything you have." Savannah stared at her sister in absolute stunned disbelief. Chelsea had been handed a brand new luxury vehicle, a fully paid-off private college education, and a lavish destination wedding that cost more than most people's homes. Savannah had lived in an unfinished, unheated basement for exactly 28 days after graduation, while she worked 3 miserable, exhausting jobs just to save enough for a security deposit on a terrible apartment across town. And yet they wielded that one single month of basic shelter like a weapon of eternal, unpayable debt. "I paid for my own groceries," Savannah replied, her voice remarkably steady and unyielding. "I paid Dad back for every cent of the electricity I used down there. I owe you absolutely nothing. Now I want both of you out of my house right this second before I call the local police and have you formally trespassed from the property." Patricia scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in Savannah's face. "You are not calling the police on your own mother. Stop throwing a childish tantrum and be practical for once in your life. You cannot afford the upkeep on a historic estate like this anyway. You lay cheap carpet and paint cabinets for a living. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you by spring. We are doing you a massive favor by moving in and taking over the financial management of the estate before you lose it to the bank." "I bought this house in cash," Savannah stated plainly, watching the heavy reality of her immense wealth strike Patricia right in the face. "I do not paint cabinets. I am a luxury real estate developer. I have more liquid capital than this entire family combined. I am not struggling in the slightest, and I definitely do not need your management. Get out." Before Patricia could formulate another delusional demand, or Chelsea could launch into another screaming fit, the sound of tires screeching violently across the gravel driveway shattered the tense silence. Savannah turned toward the heavy front windows. Richard's luxury sedan slammed into park right behind Chelsea's SUV, narrowly missing the rear bumper. The driver's side door flew open, and Richard stormed out into the freezing snow. He did not look like a proud father arriving to congratulate his daughter on a monumental life achievement. His face was a dark, rigid mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He marched up the stone steps, taking them 2 at a time, his heavy, expensive wool coat billowing behind him in the winter wind. He pushed the front door wide open, bypassing Patricia and Chelsea entirely, and marched straight up to Savannah. He lifted a thick manila legal envelope and slammed it down onto the polished surface of the antique entryway table with a resounding, terrifying crack. "You are not keeping this house!" He snarled, his voice dripping with absolute venom and malice. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Savannah. You think you can just hide a massive fortune from the people who raised you and fed you and humiliate your sister in front of the whole family right before the holidays. You think you can just buy the biggest house in town and lock us out?" Savannah glanced down at the thick manila envelope and then back up to her father's furious red face. "I bought this property with my own money," she said, refusing to back down a single inch under his towering presence. "My name is the only name on the recorded deed. It is my house, and there is nothing you can do about it." Richard leaned in dangerously close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and blind, arrogant rage. "You are dead wrong," he hissed, tapping a heavy finger against the legal envelope. "According to this legally binding promissory note, you owe my commercial development company $800,000. You borrowed that money against our family business years ago to fund your little projects, and you never paid a single cent back. I am placing a strict legal lien on this property today. You will not be able to renovate a single room, hire a single contractor, or move a single piece of furniture until my company is paid in full." Savannah felt a sudden cold chill radiate through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter air blowing through the open front door. She had never borrowed a dime from her father's business. She had never signed any promissory note. She knew exactly what he was doing in that terrifying moment. He was manufacturing a fraudulent weapon to destroy the very foundation of her newly built life. The war had escalated from petty family jealousy into full-blown financial sabotage, and her father was holding the match. Savannah did not flinch as her father slammed his fist against the entryway table. She reached out with a steady hand and pulled the thick, crisp paper from the manila envelope. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the notarized stamps, and the bold financial figures printed across the top. The document claimed she owed his commercial development company exactly $800,000. But it was the account number listed at the bottom of the page that made her stomach tighten. It was a routing number she had not seen in over a decade. It belonged to a dormant basic student checking account she had opened when she was 18 years old. Richard had co-signed on that account because she had been a teenager. He had clearly never removed his name, and now he was weaponizing that archaic piece of paper. He was using an ancient technicality and his deep corrupt connections at the local regional bank to cross-collateralize her assets. By attaching this fabricated debt to her name, he had triggered an automatic security freeze on her primary business operating accounts. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew her schedule intimately. He knew that an elite crew of specialized high-end contractors was scheduled to arrive at the Hawthorne estate in exactly 48 hours. They were booked to tackle the massive restoration of the grand ballroom. If Savannah could not wire their hefty upfront deposits by the end of the business day, they would walk off the job and her entire renovation timeline would collapse. "You really think this will work?" Savannah asked, her voice betraying absolutely no panic. "It already has." Richard sneered, his face still flushed with winter cold and arrogant victory. "Your business accounts are locked tight. You cannot move a single dollar. You cannot pay your precious contractors. You are entirely paralyzed until you sign this property over to me to clear your fabricated debt." Savannah did not waste her breath arguing. She simply turned her back on her father, her mother, and her sister, and walked down the long hallway toward the estate's private study. She locked the heavy oak door behind her, shutting out their loud, triumphant voices. She pulled out her phone and immediately dialed her corporate attorney, Mr. Dalton. The phone barely rang twice before he answered. Savannah explained the situation in rapid, precise sentences. She detailed the forged promissory note, the dormant joint student account, and the sudden freeze on her corporate funds. Over the speaker, Dalton let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. He recognized the tactics immediately. "He is using the exact same playbook he used 7 years ago," Dalton said, his voice tight with professional anger. Savannah closed her eyes as the bitter memories washed over her. 7 years ago, she had just launched her very first independent design firm. She had poured her heart, her soul, and every cent of her savings into building her brand. But Richard had not wanted an independent, successful daughter who might outshine his precious golden child. He had called in a major favor with his banking buddies and pulled her small business line of credit completely out from under her overnight. The sudden financial sabotage had bankrupted her young startup within weeks. She had been forced to take a humiliating job working as a lowly receptionist at Richard's own commercial firm just to survive. For 2 agonizing years, she had answered phones and fetched coffee while Chelsea paraded around town bragging about her flawless life and her parents' generous financial support. Richard had kept Savannah deliberately crushed under his thumb simply to ensure Chelsea remained the only star in the family. "He thinks I am still that terrified 25-year-old girl," Savannah told her attorney, staring out the study window at the snow falling on her vast estate. "He thinks he can starve me out and force me to hand over a $5 million asset just to save my credit score." "What do you need me to do?" Dalton asked, ready to draft an emergency injunction. "Nothing," Savannah replied, a cold, sharp smile forming on her lips. "I am going to handle the bank myself." Richard fully expected Savannah to spend the next 24 hours crying, begging, and pleading for a compromise. He expected her to crack under the pressure of losing her elite contractors. Instead, Savannah woke up the next morning, took a long, hot shower in her newly acquired mansion, and dressed in a perfectly tailored designer suit. She drove her unassuming car straight to the downtown branch of the local regional bank. She walked through the revolving glass doors and immediately spotted the corrupt branch manager sitting in his plush corner office. He was the man who played golf with her father every single Sunday. He was the man who had illegally authorized the freeze on her corporate accounts without a shred of due diligence. He looked up, saw Savannah standing in the lobby, and offered a smug, condescending smirk. He clearly expected her to walk into his office and beg for mercy. Savannah did not even look in his direction. She bypassed his glass office entirely and walked straight down the executive corridor toward the private, secure conference rooms. She did not need to speak with a corrupt branch manager. She had a scheduled meeting with Marcus. Marcus was a senior federal bank examiner. 3 years ago, Marcus had been facing severe financial ruin due to a messy divorce and a depreciating home he could not sell. Savannah had stepped in completely off the record and staged his property using her high-end inventory. She had transformed his unsellable house into a bidding war dream and saved his family from total bankruptcy. Marcus had never forgotten that favor. Savannah walked into the conference room and placed the forged promissory note directly on the polished mahogany table. She showed Marcus the paperwork proving the debt was tied to a dormant teenage checking account. She then showed him the digital notifications proving the branch manager had illegally used that ancient personal account to freeze her entirely separate corporate business entities. Marcus adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents. The color drained from his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the banking violations sitting right in front of him. "This is a massive breach of federal banking regulations," Marcus said, his voice deadly serious. "He illegally cross-collateralized unrelated corporate assets based on an unverified personal note." "Can you lift the freeze?" Savannah asked, her tone calm and professional. "I can do much more than that," Marcus replied, reaching for his secure laptop. "I am lifting the freeze on your business accounts immediately, and I am officially flagging this branch manager for a comprehensive federal audit. Your father and his banking buddy are about to have a very terrible week." Savannah thanked him and walked out of the bank. She did not look at the branch manager as she left, but she could see the panic setting in as federal agents began arriving at his office doors. She climbed back into her car, feeling a massive surge of justified victory. But she was not going to rely solely on local banks ever again. While sitting in the driver's seat, she opened a secure encrypted application on her phone. She accessed a highly diversified offshore financial portfolio she had been quietly building for years. With a few quick taps, She bypassed the domestic banking system entirely and wired the massive upfront deposits directly to her elite restoration contractors. The money cleared instantly. Her crew was paid in full before they even packed their trucks. Savannah drove back to the Hawthorne estate, feeling the warm glow of absolute triumph. She had beaten her father at his own cruel game. She had protected her business, exposed his corrupt connections, and secured the future of her grand renovation. As she turned her car onto the winding snow-covered street of the historic district, she looked toward the towering wrought-iron gates of her property. A fleet of heavy restoration trucks was already parked along the sweeping driveway. Men in thick winter work coats were carrying heavy equipment scaffolding and massive rolls of protective flooring toward the house. The operation was running with perfect, flawless efficiency. Savannah parked her car near the frozen marble fountain and stepped out into the crisp winter air. She felt a deep sense of pride as she walked up the stone steps ready to greet the foreman and review the architectural blueprints for the ballroom. She reached the top of the stairs and walked toward the newly restored solid mahogany double doors. But as she reached out to grasp the heavy brass handle, she stopped completely dead in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat. Taped directly across the center of her beautiful front doors, covering the intricate wood carvings and the brass hardware, was a massive bright red notice. The paper was thick, weather-resistant, and impossible to ignore. Savannah stepped closer, her eyes scanning the bold black block letters printed across the top of the terrifying document. Condemned, stop work immediately. Work. Savannah stared at the bright red sticker, her heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She read the smaller print below the bold heading. The notice claimed the entire structure was fundamentally unsafe, detailing a list of sudden catastrophic code violations that had supposedly been discovered overnight. It legally barred anyone from entering the premises or conducting any construction under threat of immediate arrest and massive daily fines. Savannah looked down at the bottom of the notice to find the official signature line. It was not signed by a standard building inspector. It was officially stamped and signed directly by the head of the city planning office. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The war had just escalated far beyond banking fraud. Her family was using every corrupt connection they had to destroy her sanctuary. Savannah reached out and ran her gloved fingers over the raised red lettering of the condemned notice taped to her front door. The winter wind whipped across the grand porch of the Hawthorne estate, but the sudden chill she felt came entirely from the signature scrawled at the bottom of the municipal order. She recognized the sloppy, aggressive handwriting instantly. It belonged to the director of city planning, but she knew exactly whose desk the paperwork had crossed to get that signature. Brandon. Chelsea's husband was a senior coordinator in the municipal permit office. He had spent the last 5 years acting as Richard's personal fixer inside City Hall, burying code violations for Richard's cheap commercial builds and fast-tracking his zoning approvals. Now Brandon was weaponizing his municipal authority to completely paralyze Savannah's estate. The foreman of the restoration crew stepped up onto the porch holding a thick stack of architectural blueprints. He took one look at the bright red sticker and let out a heavy, frustrated sigh. "Savannah, I cannot legally send my men inside," he said, his voice tight with professional regret. "If that stop work order is active and we cross that threshold, Brandon will send municipal police to arrest my entire crew for criminal trespassing and code violations. They will seize our tools and revoke our commercial licenses. I cannot risk my business." Savannah did not argue. She knew the foreman was right. Brandon had engineered a flawless bureaucratic trap. She turned to the crew and told them to pack their equipment and stand by for further instructions while keeping them fully on the payroll. As the heavy work trucks began to slowly back down the snow-covered driveway, Savannah's cell phone began to vibrate violently in her coat pocket. It was not a single call. It was a rapid, continuous stream of notifications buzzing so fast the device grew warm in her hand. She pulled the phone out and swiped across the screen. Her notifications panel was flooded with hundreds of messages from local community members, high society acquaintances, and other real estate developers in the area. They were all sending her links to the same social media broadcast. Savannah clicked the top link, and her screen immediately filled with a live video of her sister. Chelsea was sitting in the lavish living room of their parents' house, perfectly framed by the towering, professionally decorated Christmas tree. She was wearing a beige cashmere sweater, looking intentionally disheveled to project an image of profound emotional distress. Her makeup was expertly applied to look as though she had been crying for hours. Chelsea stared directly into the camera lens, letting out a shaky, rehearsed breath before she began to speak to the thousands of local followers tuning into the live broadcast. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Chelsea said, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "But my family is in absolute crisis right now, and the truth needs to come out before she hurts anyone else. My sister Savannah has been lying to everyone in this town. You all know my parents have worked tirelessly for decades to support our community. What you do not know is that my grandmother left a private medical trust fund meant to care for our aging relatives." Chelsea paused, lifting a perfectly manicured hand to wipe a fake tear from her cheek. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping into a dramatic, devastated whisper. "Savannah drained the entire account. She stole millions of dollars from her own family right before Christmas to buy the Hawthorne estate in cash. My parents are absolutely devastated. They are facing complete financial ruin because they trusted her. We are fighting to get the money back to care for our grandmother, but Savannah has locked us out and is trying to destroy the property. Please do not support her business. She is a fraud and a thief." Savannah watched the broadcast with cold, calculating precision. She watched the comments flood the screen in real time. Local socialites who had smiled in Savannah's face just last week were typing vicious, hateful messages. They were calling her a monster, a criminal, and a disgrace to the community. Chelsea had taken Savannah's quiet, independent wealth and spun it into a malicious narrative of elder abuse and theft. She had weaponized the very secrecy Savannah used to protect herself. The real-world fallout was immediate and catastrophic. While Savannah stood on the freezing porch of her paralyzed estate, her phone rang again. It was the general manager of the premier lumber yard in the county. His tone was icy and brief. He informed Savannah that he had seen the broadcast and was immediately canceling the delivery of the custom-cut European oak panels meant for the ballroom floor. He stated that his business would not associate with anyone accused of stealing from the elderly. He hung up before Savannah could even respond. 10 minutes later, an automated email chimed in her inbox. It was an official communication from the board of directors at the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. The email bluntly stated that her membership privileges were suspended effectively immediately pending a full ethical review of her character and financial conduct. The town elite had turned on her in a matter of hours. The society that worshipped Richard's loud, arrogant displays of wealth was eager to tear down the quiet, independent woman who had secretly outpaced them all. Savannah walked slowly down the stone steps and climbed into the driver's seat of her car. The heater blasted warm air against her frozen hands, but her mind was entirely focused on strategy. Her phone chimed with a new voicemail notification. She pressed play, and Patricia's smug, arrogant voice filled the quiet cabin of the car. The tone was completely devoid of the heartbreak Chelsea had just portrayed on camera. It was the voice of a predator who believed she had just cornered her prey. "Well, Savannah, I hope you are enjoying your new house," Patricia sneered over the recording. "You really overplayed your hand this time. The entire town knows exactly what kind of person you are. Nobody will do business with you. Nobody will sell you materials. You cannot even walk into the country club to show your face. You are completely ruined. But because we are a forgiving family, your father and I are willing to offer you a way out of this mess. Sign the Hawthorne estate over to us for $1 to clear your debts. Do it by tomorrow morning, or we will make sure you are permanently run out of this town. We will see you in court if you refuse. Merry Christmas." Savannah deleted the voicemail. She did not feel the crushing despair Patricia had intended to inflict. Instead, she felt a sharp, piercing clarity. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, but the picture they formed did not make sense. Patricia and Chelsea were driven by jealousy and social climbing, But Richard was a ruthless, pragmatic businessman. Halting her renovations, making fake promissory notes, and launching a massive public smear campaign was an incredibly high-risk strategy. It was too aggressive, too coordinated, and far too desperate for a simple family grudge. Richard was risking his own municipal connections and his banking relationships just to steal a single piece of real estate from his daughter. He was acting like a man whose life depended on acquiring the Hawthorne estate. Savannah pulled her car out of the driveway and headed straight toward the city. She did not waste a single second crying over her lost reputation or the vicious lies her sister had spread. She needed facts, and she needed them immediately. She dialed a highly encrypted number she kept saved for absolute emergencies. It belonged to Elias, a private forensic accountant, who specialized in dismantling offshore shell companies and tracking hidden corporate debt. Elias was ruthless, brilliant, and incredibly expensive. Savannah parked her car in a discreet underground garage downtown and met Elias in a secure private office. She handed him the forged promissory note Richard had used at the bank, the municipal stop work order signed by Brandon, and a list of Richard's primary commercial development holding companies. "I need you to tear his entire corporate structure apart," Savannah instructed, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "Look past the public filings and dig into the private mezzanine debt. Look at his recent municipal permits and track where his liquid capital has gone over the last 36 months. He is acting like a drowning man grabbing for a life raft. I need to know exactly what is pulling him under and why he needs my $5 million house to survive." Elias took the documents, his eyes scanning the signatures with professional interest. He nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. "Give me 12 hours, he said simply. "I will follow the money." Savannah spent the rest of the day in absolute quiet preparation. She ignored the hundreds of hateful messages pouring into her social media accounts. She ignored the endless calls from local gossips trying to pry for details. She returned to the Hawthorne estate under the cover of darkness. The massive house sat completely silent and dark against the snowy landscape, entirely frozen by Brandon's municipal order. She unlocked the side door and walked into the pitch-black kitchen. She did not turn on the main lights, knowing her family might have someone watching the property. She brewed a pot of black coffee by the light of a small desk lamp and spread the ballroom blueprints across the vast marble island. She was not backing down. She was going to restore this house even if she had to tear her father's empire down to the studs to do it. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. The estate was dead quiet. Then Savannah's cell phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop, shattering the silence. The caller identification displayed Elias. Savannah picked up the phone, immediately pressing it to her ear. "Did you find it?" she asked. Elias let out a low, sharp whistle over the secure line. He did not bother with pleasantries or introductions. "Savannah, your father is not trying to punish you," Elias said, his voice tight with absolute disbelief. "He is trying to save himself from total annihilation. His entire commercial development company is completely bankrupt. He has been running a massive illegal shell game for the last 5 years, and it just collapsed. He is currently facing catastrophic federal tax evasion charges and massive imminent defaults on 3 major commercial loans. He does not want to live in your house, Savannah. He desperately needs the unencumbered, free and clear equity of your $5.2 million estate to leverage a bailout. If he does not secure that asset immediately, he is going to federal prison." Savannah stood in the dark kitchen holding the phone as the incredible truth washed over her. Her father was not attacking her out of simple greed. He was fighting for his actual freedom, and he was perfectly willing to destroy his own daughter to save himself. Savannah smiled in the darkness, her eyes locked on the blueprints. The game had just changed, and she held the winning hand. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Heritage Hotel cast a brilliant golden light over the mayor's annual holiday gala. Savannah handed her heavy wool coat to the valet and paused in the grand lobby to smooth the fabric of her dress. She wore a custom-tailored emerald green gown that draped flawlessly across her figure, projecting an aura of quiet, untouchable power. She did not look like a woman whose construction site had just been slapped with a municipal stop work order. She did not look like a woman whose family had spent the last 48 hours trying to publicly destroy her reputation. She looked like a conqueror. Armed with the terrifying knowledge of her father's impending federal tax evasion charges, Savannah felt an absolute chilling sense of calm. Richard was not a mastermind playing a long game of real estate dominance. He was a cornered animal staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence, desperately trying to steal her $5 million asset to leverage his way out of bankruptcy. Knowing the truth had completely neutralized the fear her family had always relied upon to control her. Savannah adjusted the heavy leather-bound portfolio tucked under her arm, took a deep, steadying breath, and pushed open the massive oak doors leading into the main ballroom. The room was packed with the exact same local elite who had spent the entire afternoon ignoring her phone calls and canceling her business accounts. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. Heads turned the moment Savannah walked into the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd of men in tailored tuxedos and women draped in expensive diamonds. The socialites who had watched Chelsea's weeping Instagram broadcasts stared at Savannah with open hostility. Savannah kept her chin high and her expression entirely placid. She navigated the sea of judgmental stares with the effortless grace of someone holding the winning hand in a high-stakes game. Near the center of the ballroom, beside a towering swan, carved entirely from ice, Savannah spotted her targets. Patricia and Chelsea had intentionally positioned themselves directly next to Mayor Harrison, holding the most powerful man in the city hostage in a circle of manufactured tragedy. Chelsea wore an ostentatious pure white silk gown that looked far more appropriate for a bridal runway than a holiday charity event. She stood with her arms crossed, looking deeply aggrieved. Patricia clutched a crystal goblet of dark red wine, leaning in close to the mayor with a perfectly practiced expression of maternal sorrow. Savannah moved silently through the crowd, stopping just behind a large marble pillar to listen. Patricia was laying it on incredibly thick. "It is just so tragic, Mayor Harrison." Patricia sighed, placing a delicate hand over her heart. "We tried our absolute best to raise her with strong family values, but to manipulate her own elderly grandmother, to drain a private medical trust fund, just to buy a piece of historic property she cannot even afford to heat. It has torn our entire family apart right before the holidays. We are simply devastated." The mayor looked appropriately sympathetic, nodding politely while holding his own glass of sparkling water. "Elder abuse is a terrible thing, Patricia. I had absolutely no idea Savannah was capable of such profound deceit. The city takes these matters very seriously." Savannah stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly into their tight circle. "Good evening, Mayor Harrison," Savannah said, her voice smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of the defensive anger Patricia clearly expected to provoke. The mayor startled, taking a quick step backward. Patricia and Chelsea froze their eyes, going wide with genuine shock. They had fully believed their vicious social media smear campaign would keep Savannah hiding in shame at her condemned estate. Instead, she was standing right in front of them, outshining them both in the center of the most exclusive event of the year. Savannah, the mayor said, his tone suddenly stiff and heavily guarded. "I was just speaking with your mother about the incredibly unfortunate situation regarding your grandmother's finances." Savannah smiled a warm, genuine smile that completely disarmed the older man. "My mother has a truly remarkable and active imagination, Mayor Harrison. But I am actually here tonight on official city business." Savannah held out the sleek, heavy leather-bound portfolio she had carried into the room. The mayor looked at it hesitantly before reaching out to take it. "I wanted to personally present the preliminary architectural blueprints for the Hawthorne estate." Savannah continued, ensuring her voice carried clearly to the wealthy guests standing nearby. "As you know, the property is massive, and I have absolutely no need for 15,000 square feet of personal living space." She paused, letting Patricia and Chelsea hang on her every word. "I am converting the entire east wing and the rear carriage house into a state-of-the-art battered women's shelter. It will be fully funded, staffed, and operated by my development agency. We are officially calling it the Hawthorne Haven." The mayor opened the heavy leather portfolio. Inside were beautiful, highly detailed watercolor renderings of the proposed shelter, complete with therapeutic gardens, secure childcare facilities, and dedicated job training centers. The stiff-guarded look vanished from his face, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated awe. "Savannah, this is incredible!" Mayor Harrison breathed, running his finger reverently over the detailed blueprints. "This is exactly the kind of philanthropy our city desperately needs right now. You said this is fully funded by your agency." Savannah nodded, keeping her eyes locked on the mayor. "Every single dime. The capital is already secured in a dedicated, irrevocable trust. We are ready to begin the structural restorations the moment your permit office clears our paperwork." The mayor looked up from the portfolio and turned his gaze toward Patricia. His expression shifted rapidly from awe to profound confusion, and then to mild, undeniable disgust. "Patricia, you just stood there and told me your daughter stole money to buy a personal mansion to hoard her wealth. This is a multi-million-dollar charitable initiative. This is a monumental historical gift to our city." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She sputtered, searching desperately for a lie that could counter the hard physical evidence sitting in the mayor's hands. The elite guests standing nearby, who had been eagerly eavesdropping on the entire exchange, began to murmur in loud approval. The vicious rumors Chelsea had spread online evaporated in an instant, replaced by intense admiration for Savannah's incredible generosity and vision. The social tide turned so fast it left Patricia and Chelsea visibly reeling. Chelsea looked down at her white silk dress, her face turning a deep mottled shade of crimson as the crowd began to whisper about her obvious lies. Patricia tightened her grip on her wine glass, her knuckles turning stark white. She had been publicly exposed as a malicious liar in front of the most powerful man in town and half of the country club board. Patricia could not handle the sheer weight of the humiliation. Her eyes darkened with sudden violent malice. If she could not destroy Savannah's reputation with lies, she would physically ruin her moment of absolute triumph. Patricia took a sudden clumsy step forward, pretending the heel of her designer shoe had caught on the thick ballroom carpet. She let out a fake startled gasp and thrust her wineglass forward, aiming the dark red liquid directly at the center of Savannah's beautiful emerald gown. But Savannah was not the same naive girl who used to flinch at her mother's unpredictable temper. She had spent the last 24 hours analyzing every single aggressive move her family made. She saw the subtle shift in Patricia's shoulders, the deliberate tilt of her wrist, and the cold focus in her eyes. Savannah did not panic. She did not cry out. She simply executed a flawless, graceful sidestep, pivoting smoothly out of the line of fire. The heavy splash of dark red wine missed Savannah completely. It sailed through the air in a perfect, devastating arc and landed squarely on Chelsea's chest. The dark liquid splattered violently across the pristine white silk of Chelsea's extravagant gown. It instantly ruined the delicate fabric blooming outward like a massive bloody stain across her bodice and dripping heavily down onto her expensive matching shoes. Chelsea let out a piercing, high-pitched scream of absolute horror. She dropped her clutch, throwing her hands up in the air as the freezing wine soaked through to her skin. "My dress!" Chelsea shrieked, stomping her foot on the polished floor and causing the remaining drops of wine to splatter aggressively against Patricia's own legs. "Mom, what is wrong with you? You completely ruined it." Patricia stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the empty crystal glass in her hand, her face pale with absolute mortification. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The entire ballroom fell dead silent, turning to watch Chelsea's spectacular public meltdown. The mayor took a large step back, shaking his head in total disbelief at the chaotic, unhinged display happening right in front of the ice sculpture. Savannah stood perfectly still, watching her mother and sister unravel in the center of the magnificent room. She did not gloat. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Their own toxic behavior had done all the heavy lifting for her. But the sweet taste of victory was cut brutally short. A heavy, large hand clamped down on Savannah's upper arm with bone-bruising force. She turned sharply, her eyes meeting the cold, desperate face of her father. Richard had materialized from the dense crowd, his jaw locked tight, and his eyes wild with the frantic, dangerous energy of a cornered animal. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed heavily with the sour metallic smell of pure panic. He leaned in dangerously close, his iron grip tightening on her arm and pulling her slightly away from the commotion of Chelsea's ongoing screaming fit. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Richard hissed, his voice barely a rough whisper, but laced with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you can play the generous savior and humiliate my wife in public, but you are too late, too." Savannah tried to yank her arm away, but his grip was like a steel vise locking her in place. "Let go of me," she demanded quietly, keeping her composure despite the rising alarm fluttering in her chest. Richard slowly released her arm, giving her a dark, triumphant sneer that sent a sudden freezing chill straight down her spine. "Check the county registry," Richard whispered, leaning in closer, so only she could hear the devastating blow. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, you do not own the Hawthorne estate anymore." Savannah yanked her arm out of Richard's grip with a violent, forceful motion. The physical contact sent a jolt of revulsion through her chest, but her expression remained entirely impassive. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. She turned her back on him, leaving him standing in the shadow of the melting ice sculpture, alongside his dripping, humiliated wife and his screaming daughter. Savannah walked briskly through the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom and retrieved her wool coat from the valet. She stepped out into the freezing December night, the icy wind biting at her cheeks. Before she even reached the driver's side door of her car, she pulled her smartphone from her pocket. Her fingers flew across the screen, navigating directly to the county clerk's public property registry portal. She typed in the specific parcel identification number for the Hawthorne estate. The page loaded instantly. Savannah's heart slammed against her ribs like a hammer. There it was. A brand new legal filing time-stamped at exactly 3:59 that afternoon, just 1 minute before the municipal offices closed for the holiday weekend. She clicked on the PDF attachment and zoomed in on the scanned document. It was a quitclaim deed. The paperwork purported to legally transfer the absolute ownership of the Hawthorne estate from Savannah's name directly into the Wilson Family Holding Trust. The trust was entirely controlled by Richard. Savannah stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. It was a clumsy, rushed imitation of her handwriting. Beside the forged signature sat the official ink stamp of a local notary public known for handling shady off-the-books transactions for aggressive commercial developers. The digital receipt listed the filing clerk who had processed the document. It was Brandon. He had abused his senior administrative clearance inside the city permit office to bypass the mandatory 6-week review queue, shoving the fraudulent deed through the automated system the second before the servers locked down. Savannah did not drive home. She drove straight to the downtown high-rise building, where her corporate attorney, Mr. Dalton, kept his office. She called him from the car, demanding he meet her there immediately. When she walked into his corner office, the city skyline glittering coldly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dalton was already pulling up the county registry on his dual monitors. "This is a complete and total fabrication," Savannah said, throwing her coat over a leather chair. "I never signed that document. I have never even met that notary. Brandon used his city credentials to force this through the system to steal my property." Dalton took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, letting out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "I know, Savannah. The forgery is blatant. Anyone with half a brain can see that signature does not match your historical filings, but that does not change our immediate reality." "What is the reality?" Savannah asked, planting her hands firmly on the edge of his mahogany desk. "The reality is that untangling this specific type of fraud in civil court is going to take months," Dalton explained, his voice grim and pragmatic. "The justice system is incredibly slow, and the courts are basically shut down for the holiday recess. Richard knows exactly how to manipulate the bureaucratic red tape. To reverse this fraudulent transfer, we have to file a formal, quiet title action and petition a judge for an emergency injunction. Until we get a judge to officially rule that the deed is a forgery, the county registry recognizes Richard as the presumptive legal owner of the Hawthorne estate." Savannah felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. Are you telling me he can legally access my property? I am telling you that if you call the police to remove him, they will look at the recorded deed and declare it a civil matter, Dalton said, leaning forward. They will refuse to intervene. Richard has the legal right to occupy the property right now. He holds the recorded paperwork. He has effectively locked you out of your own home until the courts sort this out in the spring. Savannah drove back to the Hawthorne estate as the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light over the snow-covered landscape. The winding roads of the historic district were completely empty, but as she approached the towering stone pillars of her property, she saw a large municipal utility truck idling on the street. Savannah pulled her car to a stop near the curb and stepped out into the freezing morning air. Brandon was standing in the snow right in front of her towering wrought iron gates. He was wearing a heavy city-issued work jacket and gripping a massive pair of industrial bolt cutters. Savannah watched in absolute silence as her brother-in-law clamped the heavy steel jaws around the thick brass padlock she had installed just days prior. With a loud, sharp crack, the brass lock snapped in half. Brandon tossed the broken pieces carelessly into the snowbank and pulled a heavy galvanized steel chain from the bed of his truck, looping it securely through the iron bars and securing it with a brand-new heavy-duty combination lock. Savannah walked slowly up the driveway, her boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow. Brandon turned around, hearing her approach. He did not look guilty. He puffed his chest out, leaning the heavy bolt cutters against his shoulder, with a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "You are trespassing, Savannah," said her voice devoid of any emotion. "Actually, you are the one trespassing." Brandon shot back his breath, forming white clouds in the freezing air. "Richard sent me over to secure the perimeter. I checked the county registry this morning. The Hawthorne estate belongs to the Wilson family now. You really should have known better than to try and play games with your father. He owns this town. He owns the banks and he owns the courts." "You committed federal forgery," Brandon Savannah stated flatly. "You abused your municipal clearance to file a fake deed. You are going to go to prison for this." Brandon laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound that echoed off the frozen trees. "Nobody is going to prison, Savannah. By the time your lawyers even get a hearing scheduled on the docket, Richard will have leveraged the equity in this estate to clear his commercial debts. The house will be remortgaged to the absolute hilt. You will spend the next 5 years paying legal fees just to win back a property that is completely underwater." He took a step forward, his smirk widening into a nasty grin. "You have 24 hours to get your junk out of the carriage house before we move our furniture in. The law is on our side now. Do not make us call the police to throw you out." Savannah stood in the snow, staring at the man who had helped her family steal her ultimate triumph. Any other person would have screamed. Any other person would have threatened violence or broken down in tears at the sheer magnitude of the injustice. But Savannah was not operating on emotion. The conversation with her forensic accountant echoed perfectly in her mind. Richard was not strong. Richard was drowning in federal tax evasion charges and imminent commercial default. He was desperate. He needed this house to survive. Savannah realized in that exact moment that fighting them at the gates was a waste of time. She did not need to keep them out of the Hawthorne estate. She needed them inside. She needed them to feel completely safe, completely victorious, and totally in control. Because once they moved their lives into the mansion, the trap would finally snap shut. Savannah did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Brandon and smiled. It was a sharp, chilling smile that did not reach her eyes. "Enjoy the house," Savannah said quietly. She turned around and walked back to her car. She climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, smoothly shifting the vehicle into reverse. She backed out onto the main road, leaving Brandon standing by the locked gates, looking slightly confused by her total lack of resistance. Savannah drove exactly 2 miles down the road before pulling into the empty parking lot of a closed coffee shop. She put the car in park and pulled out her phone. She needed to feed their delusion. She needed to make Patricia and Richard believe they had completely broken her spirit. She opened her direct messages and tapped on Patricia's name. Savannah deliberately crafted the text message to sound frantic, defeated, and utterly crushed. She wanted her mother to read the words and taste absolute victory. "You win," Savannah typed, her fingers flying across the screen. "I cannot afford a massive legal battle dragging on for months. I am completely out of money and I am out of options. I am flying to Europe tomorrow morning to escape this nightmare. The house is empty." Savannah stared at the screen for exactly 3 seconds before she hit send. The message delivered instantly. She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and put the car back into drive. She was not going to Europe. She was going to war. Savannah watched her rearview mirror intently as she navigated the winding snow-packed roads leading away from the Hawthorne estate. The heavy municipal truck driven by Brandon remained parked exactly where she had left it. He had bought her performance completely. By the time she reached the interstate, she knew her mother was already showing Richard the frantic text message she had sent. They would be celebrating. They would be pouring expensive scotch and toasting their victory, believing they had successfully bullied her into fleeing the country. They thought she was a coward running away from a fight she could not afford to win. She was not running anywhere. Savannah bypassed the exit for the international airport entirely. She merged onto the southbound highway and drove toward the derelict industrial sector on the edge of the city limits. She pulled her car into a subterranean concrete parking structure hidden beneath an abandoned strip mall. The lot was completely deserted, except for a single unassuming gray sedan parked in the darkest corner of the lowest level. Savannah parked her car right next to it, cut her engine, and stepped out into the freezing damp air of the garage. The passenger door of the gray sedan swung open. Savannah climbed inside, instantly greeted by the intense blast of the vehicle's heating system and the strong smell of black coffee. Sitting behind the steering wheel was Vance. He was a retired federal investigator who now operated exclusively in the shadows, specializing in corporate espionage and high-level municipal corruption. Savannah had hired him the very second Elias the forensic accountant had uncovered Richard's massive financial black hole. She knew her father would not stop at a simple smear campaign, and she needed someone who knew exactly how to track desperate men. Vance did not offer a polite greeting. He reached into the back seat and retrieved a thick, bulging manila envelope, dropping it squarely into Savannah's lap. "Your instincts were absolutely flawless," Savannah Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Richard is out of time, and he is making incredibly sloppy mistakes. He thinks he is untouchable because he has been paying off local building inspectors for a decade. But federal tax evasion makes men reckless." He handed Brandon the keys to the kingdom, and Brandon walked right into the trap. Savannah opened the heavy envelope. Inside was a stack of high-resolution glossy photographs. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning the undeniable visual evidence. The picture showed Brandon sitting in a dingy diner on the outskirts of the county. He was sliding a thick manila folder across a sticky laminate table to a man Savannah recognized immediately. It was Marcus Vance, a disgraced former municipal clerk who now operated as a shady independent notary public. Marcus was infamous in the local real estate community for backdating documents and looking the other way when signatures did not quite match. The photographs clearly displayed the forged quitclaim deed resting on the diner table between their coffee cups. Savannah could see the bright red stamp of Marcus Vance's official notary seal pressing down onto the fraudulent paperwork. Vance reached forward and tapped the digital screen mounted on his dashboard. "The photos are just the appetizer, Savannah. The main course is the audio." I had a parabolic microphone pointed directly at their booth from a maintenance van parked across the street. "Listen to exactly how your family conducts business." He pressed play. The recording started with the muffled background clatter of silverware and diner chatter before Brandon's arrogant voice cut through the static with crystal clarity. "Richard needs this filed today." Marcus Brandon's recorded voice sneered over the speakers. "He does not care what you have to do to make it look legitimate." Savannah is out of the picture. She is completely frozen by the stop work order I slapped on her house. "Just stamp the damn paper so I can bypass the permit queue and force it into the county registry before the holiday lockdown." A nervous, raspy voice replied. It was Marcus the notary. Forging a commercial quitclaim on a $5 million historic property is federal fraud, Brandon. If Savannah brings a forensic handwriting expert into civil court, we are all going to federal prison. The signature looks rushed. You do not need to worry about civil court, Marcus. Brandon snapped back, his voice dripping with condescension. Savannah does not have the stomach for a fight. Richard and Patricia have completely destroyed her reputation in town. Nobody will lend her a dime to hire a litigation team. Besides, by the time she even realizes what happened, Richard will have drained the equity. He is paying you $50,000 in cash the second the mezzanine loan clears on the 26th. I am getting $100,000. Do you want the money, or do you want to keep notarizing used car titles for minimum wage? The recording captured the distinct heavy thud of Marcus stamping the fraudulent deed. The audio file clicked off, plunging the car back into the heavy silence of the underground garage. Savannah stared at the blank digital screen on the dashboard. Her own brother-in-law was openly bragging about stealing her property for a $100,000 payout. Her father was funding a criminal conspiracy to forge legal documents. They were casually plotting to ruin her entire future over greasy diner coffee. She felt a sharp, piercing spike of adrenaline rush through her veins. "There is more," Vance said, breaking the silence. He pulled a printed email manifest from the sun visor and handed it to her. "I intercepted the communication between Richard and a private commercial moving company located 2 counties over. He did not use a local crew because he knows you have connections with all the contractors in this city." Savannah scanned the printed manifest. The details laid out on the page were staggering in their sheer audacity. Richard had contracted 3 massive commercial box trucks. The reservation was secured with a non-refundable cash deposit. "Look at the scheduled arrival time," Vance instructed, tapping a thick finger against a highlighted row on the paper. Savannah read the timestamp and felt her breath catch in her throat. The moving trucks were scheduled to arrive at the Hawthorne estate on Christmas Eve at exactly 10 o'clock at night. "Richard is planning a physical occupation," Vance explained, his tone entirely clinical. "He knows the fraudulent deed gives him a thin veneer of presumptive legal ownership, but he also knows you could theoretically file a quiet title action and tie up the property in civil litigation for months. He cannot afford to wait months, Savannah. He has massive balloon payments due to the federal government by the end of the year. He needs that $4 million equity loan immediately." Savannah nodded slowly, piecing the brutal strategy together. "If he physically occupies the house and changes all the locks, he establishes immediate residency. If I call the police to kick him out, the police will see his recorded deed, see his furniture inside the house, and declare it a civil dispute. They will refuse to remove him." "Exactly," Vance confirmed. "Richard, Patricia, Chelsea, and Brandon are going to breach your front gates tomorrow night under the cover of darkness, while the rest of the town is distracted by holiday parties. They are going to pack up every single piece of antique furniture, every personal file, every piece of clothing you own, and throw it straight into the commercial dumpsters behind the carriage house. Once your belongings are on the street, they will move their own furniture inside. First thing Monday morning, Richard will walk into the bank with the deed and proof of physical residency and secure his bailout loan." Savannah stared at the printed moving manifest holding the physical proof of her family's ultimate betrayal. They were not just going to steal her investment. They were going to forcefully violate her sanctuary, toss her cherished possessions into the freezing snow, and use her financial ruin to save themselves from a prison sentence. Dalton, her corporate attorney, had warned her that fighting this in civil court would be a slow, agonizing process. Dalton had assumed Savannah wanted to play by the traditional rules of property law. He had assumed she wanted to politely request a judge to reverse the paperwork and return her home. Savannah looked at the high-resolution photos of Brandon and the corrupt notary. She thought about Chelsea sobbing fake tears on a live broadcast. She thought about Patricia purposefully trying to ruin her dress at the holiday gala. She thought about Richard gripping her arm and whispering that she had lost everything. A civil court battle would not hurt them enough. A quiet title action would just force Richard into bankruptcy court, where he would hide behind layers of corporate protection. Savannah did not want her money back. She wanted absolute total destruction. She wanted them to feel the exact same terror and helplessness they had tried to inflict upon her. Vance Savannah said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm pitch. I need you to send every single audio file, every photograph, and every intercepted email directly to my secure server right now. Vance nodded, pulling his laptop from the floorboard. Done. What is your play? Are you taking this to Dalton to file the emergency injunction? Savannah shook her head. No. Dalton is a civil litigator. He deals in lawsuits and financial settlements. He is too slow and too polite for what needs to happen next. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. She bypassed her legal contacts and scrolled straight to a private unlisted phone number she had acquired years ago during her early brutal battles with the city zoning commission. The number belonged to Chief Miller, the head of the municipal police department. Miller was a hard-nosed, uncompromising veteran of law enforcement. He was notoriously strict and entirely immune to the political pressure wealthy families like the Wilsons tried to exert over the city. Savannah knew for a fact that Chief Miller had been trying to nail Brandon for municipal corruption for the last 3 years, but he had always lacked the definitive smoking gun required to launch a full-scale raid on the permit office. Savannah hit the call button and pressed the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered on the other end. Miller, speaking the chief, answered, sounding annoyed at the interruption. Chief Miller Savannah said, her voice ringing with absolute crystal-clear authority. This is Savannah Wilson. I am sitting on a mountain of high-resolution photographs and pristine audio recordings proving a massive ongoing criminal conspiracy operating directly out of your city permit office. There was a sudden sharp silence on the other end of the line. The annoyance instantly vanished from the chief's voice, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a predator catching a scent. I am listening, Savannah. Savannah smiled, a cold, terrifying smile in the dim light of the parking garage. The recordings detail a $100,000 cash bribe, a forged commercial deed, and a coordinated plan to forcefully invade my private property to secure a $4 million fraudulent bank loan. My family has scheduled a commercial moving crew to physically breach the Hawthorne estate tomorrow night. She paused, letting the massive weight of the criminal charges sink in. Chief, how would you like to catch 3 felons red-handed on Christmas Eve? Chief Miller did not hesitate for a single second. The line remained dead silent for a brief moment before his deep, gravelly voice came back with absolute, unwavering conviction. He told Savannah to give him the exact address and the specific time of the planned breach. He promised her that his tactical team would be waiting in the shadows. Savannah ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat of her car. The trap was set, and the jaws were primed to snap shut, but she still had to play her part to absolute perfection. Richard was desperate, but he was not stupid. He would be watching her movements, waiting for confirmation that his brutal intimidation tactics had worked. She had to give him exactly what he wanted to see. Savannah put her car in gear and drove directly to the international airport. The holiday traffic was a nightmare of stressed travelers and flashing brake lights. But Savannah navigated the chaos with cold, calculating efficiency. She parked in the long-term garage and pulled a massive, heavy suitcase from her trunk. She had packed it full of old winter coats and heavy hardcover books just to give it the appropriate weight of a long international trip. She walked into the brightly lit departure terminal, letting the frantic holiday energy wash over her. She marched straight up to the Premier airline desk and checked her bag for a direct red-eye flight to London. She made sure to smile warmly at the ticket agent handing over her passport and engaging in light, polite conversation. She wanted the agent to remember her face. More importantly, she wanted the airport's extensive security network to record her presence. Savannah turned and walked toward the TSA security checkpoint. She stood in line, placed her items in the plastic bins, and walked through the full body scanner. As she retrieved her boots and her carry-on bag, she looked up directly into the black dome of a high-definition security camera mounted on the ceiling. Her alibi was now an ironclad digital fact. If Richard's high-priced lawyers ever tried to subpoena her travel records to prove she had orchestrated a setup, they would find undeniable government-verified proof that Savannah Wilson had checked a bag, cleared federal security, and walked into the international departure concourse. But Savannah never walked to her gate. The moment she was out of sight of the main security hub, she slipped quietly into a large, crowded family restroom near the food court. She stepped into a private stall and quickly went to work. She stripped off the expensive tailored wool coat she had been wearing and shoved it deep into her carry-on bag. She pulled out a nondescript black hooded sweatshirt, a dark pair of denim jeans, and a plain black beanie. She pulled the beanie down low over her forehead, hiding her distinctive blonde hair. She traded her recognizable designer boots for a pair of scuffed black running shoes. When she emerged from the restroom, she looked entirely different. She blended perfectly into the exhausted sea of delayed travelers. Savannah kept her head down and bypassed the departure gates entirely. She navigated her way through a series of service corridors and exited the secure zone through the lower-level baggage claim doors, stepping out into the freezing night air on the arrivals curb. She walked 2 blocks to an off-site car rental agency and used a corporate credit card registered to a subsidiary shell company to rent a dark, gray, unassuming sedan. She climbed into the driver's seat, turned the heater on blast, and headed back toward the city limits. She parked the rental car on a dark residential street, nearly a mile away from the Hawthorne estate. She needed to deliver the final piece of the illusion. Savannah pulled her smartphone from her pocket and opened her photo gallery. She scrolled back several months to a picture she had taken during a previous business trip. It was a beautiful high-resolution shot of a commercial airplane wing cutting through a sea of fluffy white clouds with a bright blue sky above. She uploaded the photo directly to her public Instagram story. She typed out a caption ensuring the tone was exactly what her mother and sister would expect to see from a defeated, broken woman running away from her problems, leaving the toxicity behind, taking a much-needed break across the pond. Savannah hit publish. She did not close the application. She sat in the dark, freezing car and watched the viewer count slowly begin to tick upward. It took exactly 4 minutes for the bait to be taken. A notification popped up showing that Chelsea's known burner account had just viewed the story. Savannah smiled a sharp, predatory smile in the darkness of the rental car. Chelsea was undoubtedly taking a screenshot right this very second and sprinting down the hallway to show Patricia and Richard. They would see the post. They would see her frantic text message. They would check the airline flight status and see that the plane to London was actively boarding. They would completely believe they had won. Savannah turned off her location tracking, disabled her cellular data, and powered the device down completely. She slipped out of the rental car and began the long, cold walk through the woods toward the back of the Hawthorne estate. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the ground in a thick, pristine layer of white. Savannah moved quietly through the dark trees, her black clothing rendering her entirely invisible in the shadows. She bypassed the chained front gates and approached the massive dark silhouette of the mansion from the rear gardens. During her initial architectural surveys of the property, she had discovered an old, forgotten servants' entrance hidden behind a wall of overgrown ivy near the basement kitchens. She unlocked the heavy wooden door and slipped inside the cavernous estate. The air inside was freezing, holding the deep, bone-chilling dampness of a house that had been abandoned for years. Savannah pulled a small tactical flashlight from her pocket, keeping the beam pointed directly at the floorboards. She navigated through the maze of dark hallways until she reached the main security hub, hidden behind a wood-paneled door in the grand foyer. She knew Brandon was arrogant, but he was not completely incompetent. When he breached the front doors, he would immediately check the ADT alarm panel to ensure the police had not been dispatched. Savannah opened the metal utility box and went to work. She completely severed the primary power lines to the standard security system, disabling the cellular backup battery and cutting the physical wires to the wall-mounted sirens. The entire system went completely dead. When Brandon looked at the panel, he would see a black, lifeless screen. He would assume the property's power grid had been shut down by the city's stop work order. He would feel incredibly safe. Savannah dropped her heavy duffel bag onto the dusty marble floor of the foyer and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, resting in protective foam packaging, were 4 military-grade infrared surveillance cameras provided by Vance. These were not standard home security cameras. They were incredibly small, roughly the size of a deck of cards, and painted a flat matte black to eliminate any light reflection. They possessed advanced night vision capabilities and ran on independent lithium batteries. More importantly, they did not rely on the house's disabled Wi-Fi network. Each camera possessed its own encrypted cellular uplink, streaming high-definition audio and video directly to Vance's secure offshore cloud server. Savannah moved a heavy wooden stepping stool into the center of the grand foyer. She climbed up and mounted the first camera directly inside the ornate plaster crown molding above the main entrance, giving it a perfect unobstructed view of the heavy front doors. She mounted the second camera behind the crystal teardrops of a massive wall sconce, capturing the entire length of the main corridor. She placed the third camera in the shadows above the grand staircase and secured the final camera inside the formal living room, where she knew Richard would inevitably set up his command center to sort through her belongings. She activated the power switches on each device, watching the tiny indicator lights blink green before going completely dark. The estate was now a fully operational surveillance trap. No matter what Richard tried to destroy or deny, the digital evidence would be instantly preserved off-site. Savannah retreated from the foyer and walked down the long hallway toward the formal dining room. The time for preparation was over. All she had to do now was wait. It is exactly 9 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. The Hawthorne estate is completely submerged in absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy snowfall outside has blanketed the towering windows, blocking out the faint ambient glow of the distant city streetlights. The temperature inside the mansion has plummeted, causing Savannah's breath to form faint white clouds in the freezing air. She is sitting perfectly still in a high-backed antique wooden chair at the head of the massive mahogany dining table. The heavy, solid oak double doors separating the dining room from the grand foyer are pulled tightly shut. Savannah is not sitting in the darkness alone. Seated directly to her right is Chief Miller. The veteran police chief is a large, imposing man with a thick gray mustache and eyes that look like chipped flint. He is wearing heavy, dark tactical gear and sipping lukewarm black coffee from a battered steel thermos. Chief Miller has hated Richard Wilson for years. Richard has constantly used his wealth and political connections to bypass city safety codes, putting emergency responders at risk, just to save a few dollars on his commercial builds. Brandon has been a persistent, irritating leak inside the permit office, feeding police schedules to corrupt contractors. Tonight is deeply personal for Chief Miller. Spaced out around the long dining table are 3 heavily armed tactical police officers. They are entirely silent, moving with disciplined precision as they run final checks on their equipment. They blend seamlessly into the shadows, waiting for the command to move. Sitting across from Savannah is Marcus Sterling, a prominent and notoriously aggressive local investigative journalist. Savannah had called him immediately after securing Chief Miller's cooperation. Sterling had spent the last 5 years trying to expose Richard's predatory real estate practices, but he had always hit a solid brick wall of expensive lawyers and sealed court documents. When Savannah offered him an exclusive front-row seat to the spectacular downfall of the Wilson family empire, Sterling had canceled his holiday plans without a second thought. His cameraman is crouching silently by the heavy oak doors, with a professional night vision lens pressed carefully against a tiny crack in the wood, framing the grand foyer perfectly. The silence inside the dining room is thick, heavy, and suffocating. The tension is a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Savannah watches the seconds tick away on her illuminated watch face. 9:15, 9:30, 9:45. Then it happens. A sudden brilliant flash of harsh yellow light sweeps aggressively across the frosted glass of the front windows. The bright beams cut through the falling snow, illuminating the dark walls of the grand foyer. The heavy, low mechanical rumble of a massive diesel engine vibrates through the thick wooden floorboards beneath their boots. The sound grows louder and more aggressive, echoing off the stone walls of the estate. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the snow-packed driveway breaks the stillness of the night. The massive commercial moving truck has arrived at the gates. Savannah sat completely motionless in the pitch-black dining room, her eyes fixed intensely on the glowing screen of the digital tablet resting flat on the mahogany table. The high-definition infrared cameras transmitted a pristine, crystal-clear feed of the front gates. The heavy diesel engine of the massive commercial moving truck idled loudly, its low mechanical rumble vibrating through the frozen ground and echoing against the stone walls of the estate. The truck was enormous, completely blocking the main entrance. Behind it, the twin halogen headlights of a sleek luxury sedan cut sharply through the heavy falling snow, casting long, distorted shadows across the winter landscape. Savannah watched as the doors of the sedan swung open. Richard stepped out into the raging blizzard wearing a dark, expensive cashmere overcoat. He did not look like a desperate man staring down the barrel of federal tax evasion charges and catastrophic commercial default. He looked like an arrogant king arriving to claim his conquered territory. Patricia emerged from the passenger side, pulling a heavy fur-trimmed hood over her perfectly coiffed hair. She was clutching a designer handbag, holding it tight against her chest, as she stepped gingerly into the ankle-deep snow, complaining immediately about the bitter cold. Chelsea followed, whining visibly, as her expensive leather boots sank into the freezing slush. Brandon hopped down from the cab of the moving truck, a smug, triumphant expression plastered across his face. He walked toward the heavy wrought iron gates and simply pulled the heavy chain loose, dragging the massive metal barriers open to allow the commercial moving truck to slowly grind its way up the long, winding driveway. Richard climbed back into his sedan and followed the truck, parking directly in front of the grand marble steps of the main entrance. The audacity of the operation was staggering. They were not sneaking around the back entrance. They were not trying to conceal their presence in the dark. Richard was operating under the absolute assumption that his forged municipal paperwork made him completely untouchable. He believed Savannah was thousands of miles away, weeping in a hotel room in London. He believed the city police force was entirely in his pocket. He was wrong on every single count. Inside the dining room, the silence was absolute and suffocating. Chief Miller leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table, his eyes locked on the digital feed. His jaw was set in a rigid, unyielding line. The veteran police chief had spent years building corruption files on Richard Wilson, watching the man slither out of indictments through political donations and high-priced defense attorneys. Tonight there were no lawyers. There were no campaign contributions. There was only raw, unedited footage of a billionaire orchestrating a blatant felony burglary. Chief Miller's hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered service weapon. Beside him, the three tactical officers remained perfectly still, their breathing slow and controlled in the freezing darkness. They moved with disciplined precision, double-checking their heavy tactical vests and securing their earpieces. Marcus Sterling, the prominent investigative journalist, sat across from Savannah with a hungry, predatory gleam in his eyes. He had spent half a decade trying to convince his editors that Richard Wilson's real estate empire was built on fraud and violent intimidation. Now he was sitting in the dark, watching the man personally oversee a forced entry into his own daughter's home. Sterling's cameraman was already positioned on the floor by the heavy oak doors, his night vision lens pressed flush against a slight gap in the wood, capturing the entire grand foyer in stark green monochrome. On the screen, a third vehicle, a battered, unmarked white panel van, skidded to a halt behind the moving truck. A man stepped out carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. He wore a dark wool cap pulled low over his eyes and kept his jacket zipped tight against the biting wind. This was the shady locksmith Savannah had anticipated. He was not a licensed bonded professional. He was a shadow operator paid in untraceable cash to ask zero questions and bypass high-security residential hardware. Brandon walked up the marble steps and pointed directly at the massive custom-built mahogany front doors of the Hawthorne estate. The locksmith dropped his heavy canvas bag onto the snow-covered porch and pulled out a heavy-duty industrial drill. Richard stood safely under the grand portico, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Get it open!" Richard commanded, his voice picked up perfectly by the hidden exterior microphones. "And do not damage the wood. I am selling this place the second the banks open and clear the equity line." The noise began. It started as a low mechanical whine that quickly escalated into a violent high-pitched screech as the titanium drill bit chewed into the reinforced brass deadbolt. The sound echoed viciously through the empty, cavernous halls of the mansion. It was a brutal, invasive noise. Savannah felt a momentary spike of adrenaline pulse through her veins, but she forced her heart rate to slow down. She did not flinch. She watched the screen with cold, detached precision. Beside her, Chief Miller gave a subtle, silent hand signal. The three armed tactical officers reached down in perfect unison, drawing their heavy police radios from their utility belts. They held the black devices close to their chests, their thumbs hovering a fraction of an inch above the transmission buttons, waiting for the exact moment to call in the patrol cruisers stationed out of sight at the bottom of the hill. The perimeter was already secured. 6 unmarked police cruisers were idling in the dark, completely blocking the only exit route from the Hawthorne estate. The commercial moving truck and the luxury sedan were boxed in. There was no escape. On the digital monitor, Savannah watched the locksmith pull the drill back and toss it into the snow. The drill was not enough to break the custom hardware. He reached into his canvas bag and retrieved a massive steel crowbar. He wedged the flat edge of the heavy tool directly into the seam between the heavy mahogany double doors and the reinforced door frame. Brandon stepped up beside him, placing his shoulder against the wood, pushing with all his weight. The grinding, tearing sound of splintering wood and warping metal filled the air. Patricia stood at the bottom of the steps with her arms crossed, shivering in the cold, but watching the destruction with an expression of impatient entitlement. Chelsea was holding up her smartphone, recording the entire break and likely planning to post a triumphant tour of her newly stolen mansion to her social media followers. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her footage would soon be entered as evidence in a federal prosecution. Inside the dining room, the cameraman adjusted his focus, capturing the violent flexing of the front doors from the inside. Marcus Sterling gripped his notebook, his pen hovering over the blank page. He was witnessing the absolute, undeniable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. He had the story of a lifetime unfolding right in front of his eyes. The horrific screech of tearing metal grew louder. The locksmith leaned his entire body weight onto the steel crowbar, grunting heavily with the physical effort. Brandon shoved his shoulder against the mahogany panels one final time, bracing his boots against the icy marble porch. With a massive, deafening crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the silent house, the heavy brass locks finally gave way. The reinforced deadbolt shattered completely, sending jagged pieces of metal flying across the polished marble floor of the grand foyer. The heavy double doors swung violently inward, crashing against the interior walls. The freezing winter wind immediately howled into the pristine grand foyer, carrying a swirling vortex of white snow across the dark marble. The sudden drop in temperature inside the house was instantaneous. Savannah could feel the icy draft seeping under the dining room doors, biting sharply at her ankles. On the infrared monitors, Savannah watched the perfect high-definition feed as the hidden military-grade cameras captured every single angle of the breach. The digital evidence was already streaming directly to the secure offshore cloud server, completely untouchable by anyone in her family. Richard stepped out of the freezing shadows and crossed the threshold, entering the grand foyer. He stopped in the center of the marble floor, brushing a thick layer of snow off the shoulders of his expensive coat. He looked around the dark, empty space, taking in the absolute silence of the cavernous estate. He did not look worried. He did not look cautious. He looked absolutely victorious. Richard threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer and penetrated the thick wooden doors of the dining room. "I told you she was weak," Richard boasted, turning back to look at Patricia and Brandon, who were stepping into the house behind him. The stupid girl left the alarm off. "Bring the boxes in." The cold wind howled through the shattered doorway, carrying violent gusts of snowflakes that melted instantly against the polished marble floor. Richard stood in the center of the grand foyer, surveying his new domain like a conquering general. He brushed a thick layer of snow off the shoulders of his expensive cashmere overcoat and breathed in the freezing damp air. He did not look worried. He did not look like a desperate man staring down the barrel of federal tax evasion charges and catastrophic commercial default. He looked absolutely victorious. Brandon reached for the heavy brass light switches mounted on the wall near the entrance. He flicked them up and down several times. Nothing happened. The towering foyer remained submerged in deep, heavy shadows illuminated only by the sweeping beams of the vehicle headlights outside and the narrow beams of the heavy-duty flashlights the moving crew carried. Brandon scoffed and turned back to his father-in-law. "Power is completely dead," Brandon said, his voice echoing sharply in the cavernous space. The city must have hard-cut the grid when they issued the stop work order. It does not matter. The moving crew has industrial spotlights in the truck. Richard waved his hand dismissively. He did not care about the darkness. He only cared about the square footage and the immediate, undeniable proof of physical residency. The sharp, aggressive clack of designer heels echoed over the marble. Patricia stepped carefully over the ruined brass deadbolt, holding her heavy fur-trimmed coat tight against her chest. In her gloved hands, she clutched a chilled bottle of Cristal champagne, the gold label catching the erratic beams of the flashlights. She looked around the grand space with a mixture of manufactured awe and immediate harsh judgment. "It smells like dust and failure," Patricia declared, her voice ringing with absolute entitlement. "But the bones are excellent. The architectural details are acceptable." She turned toward the crew of burly, silent movers waiting on the front steps. She immediately began barking orders, her tone dripping with unquestionable authority. "Listen to me," she commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the sweeping grand staircase. "I want the master suite cleared first. Take all her cheap art, every single piece of that pathetic thrift store furniture, and throw it directly into the snow. Do not bother boxing any of it up. Just toss it over the balcony if you have to. I want the master bedroom cleared immediately so the cleaners can start scrubbing away her scent." The movers exchanged hesitant glances. Trashing a multi-million-dollar historic home was not standard operational protocol for a commercial relocation crew. Brandon stepped forward, pulling a thick wad of $100 bills from his coat pocket. He shoved the cash roughly into the foreman's chest. "You heard her," Brandon growled, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "You are getting paid triple your holiday rate to ask 0 questions. Start moving the garbage." The foreman nodded and pocketed the cash. He signaled his crew, and the heavy thud of their boots began echoing up the grand staircase. Chelsea pushed past the workers, shivering violently in her thin designer coat. She ignored the freezing winter wind whipping through the broken double doors. Her priority was not the temperature or the logistics of the hostile takeover. Her priority was her audience. She pulled a large, expensive smartphone from her pocket and snapped a circular battery-powered ring light onto the top edge. She clicked it on. A harsh, bright white halo of LED light illuminated the center of the dark foyer, casting long, distorted, eerie shadows against the vintage wallpaper. Chelsea held the phone high, framing her face perfectly in the center of the glowing ring. She tapped the digital screen, initiating a live broadcast to her massive social media following. She instantly completely transformed her freezing, miserable expression into a radiant, performative, glowing smile. "Hey guys, Merry Christmas Eve." Chelsea practically squealed into the microphone, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble. "I know it is super late, but I just had to share this incredible moment with you all. We are officially moving into our new family estate. It has been a massive transition, and honestly, dealing with the previous owner was a complete, total nightmare. She was incredibly toxic and unstable, and she just walked away from the property. But we are finally bringing life and love back into this gorgeous, historic mansion." She spun in a slow circle, panning the camera across the soaring ceilings, the sweeping staircase, and the intricate plaster molding. She made sure to capture the movers hauling Savannah's antique entry table toward the front door. "We are literally starting from scratch tonight," Chelsea narrated, her voice dripping with fake positivity. "Out with the old negative energy and in with the new. We are claiming our space." Richard watched his daughter broadcasting to her thousands of followers. The adrenaline of the successful physical breach and the sheer blinding arrogance of his perceived victory surged through his veins. He felt completely invincible. He had bullied his daughter out of the country, forged municipal documents, hired off the books contractors, and broken into a historic landmark. He wanted the world to know that he had won. He wanted everyone in his social circle to see him standing victorious inside the most coveted property in the county. He stepped directly into the bright, harsh glow of Chelsea's ring light, throwing his arm proudly around her shoulders. He grinned directly into the camera lens, his teeth gleaming in the LED halo. "It is a Christmas miracle," Richard declared loudly, his voice booming with forced joviality. He leaned closer to the microphone, eager to boast about his cunning, ruthless business acumen. He believed his daughter's followers would view him as a brilliant, untouchable tycoon. He believed Savannah was currently shivering in a cramped London hotel room, completely powerless and utterly defeated. He had absolutely no fear of any consequences. "Cost me 50 grand in cash to get that notary to sign the deed," Richard bragged, his voice echoing through the frozen foyer. "But securing a $5 million house is worth every single penny." Inside the pitch-black dining room, the air turned instantly to ice. Savannah sat perfectly still, her hands resting flat on the cold mahogany table. She did not breathe, she did not blink. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the rhythmic intensity of a war drum. Across from her, Marcus Sterling stopped writing. The investigative journalist stared at the crack in the door, his eyes wide with absolute total disbelief. Richard Wilson had just bypassed a complex, multi-year corruption investigation by openly bragging about felony forgery and bribery on a public live-streamed platform. He had just confessed to a major federal crime while standing inside the scene of the crime. The cameraman, kneeling by the door, gave Sterling a frantic, silent thumbs up in the dark. He had captured the entire confession, the audio and the visual in pristine, high-definition night vision. Chief Miller slowly turned his heavy head to look at Savannah. The veteran police chief's face was carved from solid stone, but his eyes gleamed with a cold, intense, predatory satisfaction. He had waited years to hear Richard Wilson admit to his sprawling web of crimes. He had spent countless hours trying to untangle the bribes, the shell companies, and the fraudulent building permits. Now Richard had just handed him the definitive smoking gun gift, wrapped and broadcast to the entire world. Chief Miller looked Savannah directly in the eyes. He gave a single sharp, definitive nod. The trap had been triggered. The bait had been swallowed whole. The jaws had snapped permanently shut. It was time to pull the curtain back. Savannah stood up from the antique dining chair. She moved with total, absolute silence, her black sneakers making zero sound against the wooden floorboards. She walked to the heavy oak double doors separating the dining room from the grand foyer. She reached out and grasped the cold brass handles. With one swift, forceful motion, she pulled the doors open and stepped out into the freezing, wind-swept corridor. She did not look at her father grinning arrogantly into the camera. She did not look at her sister holding the glowing ring light. She did not look at her mother clutching the bottle of expensive champagne. She kept her eyes fixed intently on the dark wall to her right. Savannah reached up and grabbed the heavy metal lever of the master electrical breaker box she had bypassed hours earlier. She gripped the cold steel handle and threw it upward with all her strength. 3 massive, 3-tiered crystal chandeliers flared to life simultaneously. They erupted with blinding, inescapable, brilliant light, instantly flooding the entire grand foyer and completely washing out Chelsea's tiny ring light. The sudden transition from absolute pitch-black darkness to brilliant, blinding light was violently disorienting. Thousands of precision-cut crystal prisms hanging from the 3 massive chandeliers caught the electrical surge and refracted the light into a harsh, inescapable glare that banished every single shadow in the grand foyer. Richard's triumphant laughter cut off instantly, transforming into a sharp gasp of physical pain. He stumbled backward, raising his thick arms to shield his dilated pupils from the aggressive, sudden brightness. Patricia shrieked in surprise, dropping her hands from her designer handbag to cover her face, her heavy fur coat slipping off one shoulder. Brandon froze completely, his broad chest heaving as he threw a hand over his eyes, entirely blinded by the sudden explosion of light. Chelsea let out a high-pitched scream of genuine terror. The sudden shock caused her fingers to spasm violently. The expensive smartphone slipped from her perfectly manicured grip and plummeted toward the floor. The heavy device struck the polished marble with a sharp, sickening crack, but the durable screen miraculously did not shatter. The phone landed face up, resting at an awkward angled tilt against the base of a marble column. The attached portable ring light flickered once, but remained fully illuminated. The live stream did not disconnect. Instead, the camera lens was now perfectly positioned on the ground, angling upward to capture a wide, dramatic shot of the entire paralyzed family standing frozen in the center of the foyer. Thousands of digital viewers were still watching the broadcast, completely mesmerized by the sudden chaotic turn of events. Savannah did not flinch against the glare. She had been staring at the illuminated tablet screen in the dark dining room, allowing her eyes to adjust to the brightness. She stepped forward, moving to the edge of the sweeping grand staircase. She stood at the very top of the curved marble steps, looking down at the invading forces like a queen surveying a band of treasonous peasants. She wore her dark tactical clothing, her posture rigid and completely commanding. There was no trace of the frightened, bullied daughter they had expected to find. There was only cold, calculated authority. "You are right, Chelsea," Savannah said, her voice carrying a dangerous, icy edge. Her words echoed perfectly against the high, vaulted ceilings, ringing out across the cavernous marble room and feeding directly into the microphone of the dropped smartphone. "It is a beautiful night for a live stream." Savannah finished, her eyes locking directly onto her sister. The sound of Savannah's voice broke the momentary paralysis gripping the family. Patricia lowered her hands, blinking rapidly as her eyes adjusted to the harsh chandelier light. When she saw Savannah standing at the top of the stairs, her initial shock instantly morphed into a mask of ugly, entitled rage. Patricia was completely incapable of processing defeat. She operated under the absolute assumption that her family was entirely untouchable. "What are you doing here?" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the large space. "You are supposed to be on a plane to London. You sent that pathetic text message whining about leaving. Get down here right now and turn those lights off. You are interrupting the moving crew." Savannah did not move a single muscle. "I did not send a pathetic text message, Mother. I sent bait. And you swallowed it whole." "You insolent little brat," Patricia snapped, taking a threatening step toward the bottom of the staircase. "You have always thrown these ridiculous dramatic tantrums right before you surrender. You threw a tantrum when Richard took your college fund to pay for Brandon's legal fees. You threw a tantrum when we sold your first design patent. But you always fold Savannah. You always back down. Now get out of this house before we have the movers throw you out along with your cheap furniture." Brandon recovered his vision and stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared in a stance of physical intimidation. He pointed a thick finger up at Savannah. "You heard her. The game is over, Savannah. The power is back on, but that does not change a single thing. We own this property now." He turned his head and shouted toward the open front doors where the bitter winter wind was still howling into the foyer. "Hey, Brandon," yelled at the hired crew waiting on the snow-covered porch. "Stop standing around in the freezing cold. Get in here and start clearing the master suite. I want her trash on the curb in 10 minutes. The movers did not move. The foreman stood on the top step of the porch, his eyes darting from Savannah standing rigidly at the top of the stairs to the wildly aggressive family screaming in the foyer. The foreman had been paid in cash to ignore permits, but he was not an idiot. He recognized a disastrous legal trap when he saw one. He took a slow, deliberate step backward away from the shattered mahogany doors, shaking his head. Richard pushed past Brandon, his face twisting into a furious, ugly sneer. His initial shock had completely evaporated, replaced by the overwhelming arrogance of a man who believed his money shielded him from all consequences. He reached a heavy hand into the inside pocket of his cashmere overcoat. "You think you are clever," Richard spat, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think setting up a little ambush and turning on the lights is going to stop me? You are nothing, Savannah. You are a weak, overly emotional girl playing a game you do not have the stomach for. You want to play hardball? Fine, let us play." Richard pulled a thick, folded manila document from his coat. He whipped it open, shaking the thick parchment paper aggressively in the air. The bright red ink of Marcus Vance's fraudulent notary stamp was clearly visible against the white page. "This is a registered commercial quitclaim deed," Richard shouted, waving the forged document toward the top of the stairs. This piece of paper legally transfers full absolute ownership of the Hawthorne estate to my holding company. Your signature is right here at the bottom. It is notarized. It is finalized. You have absolutely zero legal right to be standing inside my property." Savannah descended 2 steps. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely predatory. "That is a fascinating piece of paper, Richard. Tell me, did Marcus charge you his standard minimum wage fee for that red stamp, or did he charge you the $50,000 in cash you just bragged about on Chelsea's live broadcast?" Richard's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He pointed the rolled-up deed directly at Savannah's chest. "I do not care what you think you heard. I do not care what little traps you think you have set. This document makes me the sole legal owner of this estate. You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out that front door and disappear into the snow." Savannah descended 3 more steps, moving closer to the center of the foyer. "And if I refuse to leave my own home?" "Then you leave me no choice!" Richard growled, his voice rising to a furious crescendo. "You are trespassing on private commercial property. Get out of my house, Savannah, or I am calling the cops right now to arrest you for trespassing. I will have you dragged out of here in handcuffs and thrown in a holding cell for the holiday." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, holding it up like a weapon. He unlocked the screen and held his thumb over the keypad, fully prepared to dial the emergency dispatch number. He believed the local police force was his personal security team. He believed he could snap his fingers and have Savannah forcibly removed from the premises. He was completely wrong. Savannah stopped descending the stairs. She stood perfectly still, bathed in the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. She did not look at Richard. She looked past him, directing her gaze toward the heavy solid oak double doors of the formal dining room, resting in the shadows just off the main foyer. "No need, Richard," a deep, gravelly voice echoed through the massive room. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. The sound of heavy tactical boots stepping onto the polished marble floor broke the tense silence. Chief Miller stepped out of the pitch-black darkness of the dining room and into the bright light of the foyer. The veteran police chief stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad chest covered by a heavy black tactical vest. The gold shield of the municipal police department gleamed brightly under the chandelier light pinned securely to his chest. His hand rested casually on his utility belt. His eyes locked onto Richard with the cold, calculating intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "We are already here," the chief said, his voice dangerously soft but carrying absolute authority. Richard froze completely. The cell phone slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp clatter next to Chelsea's broadcasting device. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Patricia gasped, pressing her hand against her mouth as she stumbled backward away from the police chief. Brandon's jaw dropped open, his aggressive posture instantly collapsing into pure, unadulterated terror. Chief Miller did not step out alone. 3 heavily armed tactical police officers filed out of the dining room directly behind him, spreading out in a swift, coordinated tactical formation to block any potential exit. They moved with absolute silence, sealing the family inside the grand foyer. But the final blow did not come from the police. Marcus Sterling, the city's most aggressive investigative journalist, stepped out of the shadows right behind Chief Miller. He was holding a digital audio recorder, extending it toward the paralyzed family. Right beside him, his professional cameraman stepped into the light, hoisting a massive shoulder-mounted broadcast camera. The bright red recording light on the front of the lens glared intensely, staring directly into Richard's terrified face, capturing every single drop of sweat forming on his brow. The blinding glare of the 3-tiered crystal chandeliers hit the intruders with the force of a physical blow. For one agonizing second, the entire grand foyer was frozen in a stark, terrifying tableau. Richard stood dead center, his arms still raised toward the sweeping staircase, the forged quitclaim deed clutched in his trembling fist. His arrogant grin melted instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The sudden realization that he had walked directly into a heavily orchestrated federal-level trap paralyzed him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the tactical flashlights and the steady whir of Marcus Sterling's professional broadcast camera recording every single drop of sweat on Richard's pale forehead. Then the paralysis broke and absolute chaos erupted. Richard dropped the forged deed. The thick parchment paper fluttered harmlessly down to the wet marble floor. His survival instinct overpowered all rational thought. He spun on his heel, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the melted snow, and lunged toward the shattered mahogany front doors. He did not care about his wife. He did not care about his daughters. He only cared about escaping the flashing red light of the news camera and the heavy steel badges of the tactical officers. He made it exactly 3 steps. 2 heavily armored police officers launched themselves forward from the dining room shadows, moving with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. The first officer hit Richard squarely in the chest, wrapping thick muscular arms around his cashmere overcoat. The momentum lifted the billionaire entirely off his feet. The second officer grabbed Richard's flailing legs. They drove him violently downward. Richard's body slammed into the hard marble floor with a sickening bone-rattling thud that echoed into the high-vaulted ceiling. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp wheeze. Richard thrashed wildly, kicking his polished dress shoes and throwing blind punches. He screamed obscenities, demanding his lawyer, threatening to sue the entire police department into bankruptcy. The tactical officers did not flinch. They ignored his wealth and his empty threats. One officer drove a heavy knee sharply into the center of Richard's back, pinning him flat against the freezing stone. The other grabbed Richard's wrists, twisting his arms forcefully upward and slamming a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply over the noise. Patricia watched her husband get tackled to the ground and let out a piercing, hysterical scream. Her perfectly maintained high society composure completely disintegrated. She took a stumbling, panicked step backward. Her fur-trimmed coat slipped heavily off her shoulders. Her hands shook violently. The chilled bottle of Cristal champagne slipped through her manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the ground and struck the edge of the marble steps. The heavy green glass shattered instantly into 100 glittering pieces. The $500 vintage exploded, sending a foamy spray of expensive alcohol across the pristine floorboards, mingling with the filthy melted snow and the mud tracked in by the moving crew. Patricia barely had time to register the shattered glass before a female tactical officer closed the distance between them. The officer reached out and grabbed Patricia's wrists, pulling her hands aggressively behind her back. "Do not touch me," Patricia shrieked, thrashing her shoulders and kicking her designer heels. "Do you know who I am? I am Patricia Wilson. You work for me." The officer ignored the tantrum entirely. She twisted Patricia's arms higher, ignoring the sharp cry of pain, holding her firmly in place as she secured the steel cuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer barked, her voice cutting right through Patricia's screaming. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." On the other side of the foyer, Brandon watched the brutal takedown of his father-in-law. He watched the heavy steel cuffs snap onto Patricia's wrists. The smug, arrogant expression he had worn since arriving at the gates completely vanished. Brandon was a coward at his core. He had spent his entire life leeching off the Wilson family wealth and using Richard's power to shield himself from consequence. Now facing a dozen armed officers and a live news broadcast, his loyalty evaporated in a fraction of a second. Brandon threw his hands high into the air, his palms facing outward in a universal gesture of immediate, unconditional surrender. He backed away from Richard, pressing his spine against the floral wallpaper of the corridor. It was his idea. Brandon screamed, his voice pitching upward into a frantic, terrified whine. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Richard, who was currently struggling under the weight of 2 police officers. "Do not arrest me. Richard paid me. He forced me to do it. He handed me $50,000 in cash in a diner parking lot to forge the city documents. I did not want to do it, but he threatened to cut my wife off." "Shut your mouth, you pathetic idiot," Richard roared from the floor, twisting his neck to glare at his son-in-law. "I have the texts to prove it," Brandon yelled, ignoring Richard entirely and looking desperately at Chief Miller. "I saved all the encrypted messages. I can give you access to his offshore shell accounts. I can give you the names of the building inspectors he bribed. I will testify to everything. Just let me walk out of here." Chief Miller stepped forward, his boots crunching over the shattered champagne glass. He looked at Brandon with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. "You are a corrupt municipal official actively participating in felony property fraud and commercial burglary." Miller said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You do not get to make deals tonight, Brandon. You get to call a lawyer." Miller nodded to a waiting officer. The officer stepped forward, grabbed Brandon by the collar of his jacket, and slammed him face first against the wall. Brandon did not fight back. He whimpered softly as the officer yanked his arms back and secured his wrists tightly with thick plastic zip ties, pulling the rigid plastic so tight it bit into Brandon's flesh. In the center of the chaos, Chelsea was staring down at the marble floor in pure, unadulterated horror. Her expensive smartphone was still propped up against the base of the column, the bright halo of the portable ring light illuminating the entire disastrous scene. She saw the viewer count on the screen. It had skyrocketed. 10,000 people, 20,000 people. Her entire network of country club friends, wealthy influencers, and high society rivals were currently watching a live high-definition broadcast of her parents getting dragged across the floor in handcuffs. They were listening to her husband openly confess to accepting bribes. Her carefully curated digital empire was burning to the ground in real time. Chelsea dropped to her knees, scrambling frantically across the wet, slippery marble. Her expensive coat dragged through the spilled champagne and melted snow, ruining the delicate fabric. She reached desperately for the phone, her fingers clawing at the smooth screen, trying to locate the button to end the live broadcast. She was sobbing hysterically, her perfect makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. "Turn it off!" Chelsea wailed, hitting the screen with a trembling finger. "Stop watching. Everyone stop watching." Before she could reach the power button, a heavy black tactical boot stepped firmly onto the corner of the device, pinning it to the floor. Chelsea looked up, following the line of the dark uniform, to see a towering police officer staring down at her. The officer reached down and scooped the phone off the marble floor. He did not turn it off. He simply turned the camera lens directly toward Chelsea, capturing her ruined makeup and her desperate, pathetic sobbing for the thousands of viewers still watching. "This device is now active evidence in an ongoing federal investigation," the officer stated calmly, securing the phone inside a clear plastic evidence bag. The red recording icon continued to pulse brightly through the plastic casing, broadcasting her ultimate humiliation to the world. Marcus Sterling stood near the dining room doors, holding a microphone and speaking rapidly into the main broadcast camera. His voice was loud and clear, cutting perfectly through the chaotic background noise of screaming suspects and barking police orders. "We are broadcasting live from the historic Hawthorne Estate," Sterling reported, his eyes gleaming with professional triumph. "What you are witnessing is the absolute collapse of the Wilson family real estate empire. Richard Wilson, a man who has dominated the city's housing market through intimidation and alleged corruption, is currently being placed under arrest for what appears to be a massive coordinated effort to execute a fraudulent commercial property seizure." Savannah watched the entire scene unfold from the top of the grand staircase. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched the people who had terrorized her, tortured her, and tried to ruin her life face the absolute terrifying reality of consequence. They had believed she was weak. They had believed her kindness was a flaw to be exploited. They had pushed her into a corner expecting her to surrender. Instead, she had built a trap that dismantled their entire existence in less than 5 minutes. The tactical officers hauled Richard to his feet. His designer coat was torn and soaked with muddy water. His face was purple with rage, but he had stopped fighting. He knew it was over. 2 officers grabbed Patricia by the arms and began dragging her forcefully toward the shattered front doors. She was stumbling in her ruined heels, her expensive jewelry clanking against the steel handcuffs, dragging her wrists down. She was sobbing loudly, demanding to speak to the mayor. Savannah began to descend the sweeping marble staircase. She moved slowly, purposefully, her footsteps silent against the stone. She walked straight into the center of the chaotic foyer, stepping effortlessly around the shattered glass and the puddles of freezing water. The police officers parted slightly, allowing her to pass. Chief Miller watched her approach, giving her a brief, respectful nod. Savannah stopped directly in the path of the officers, escorting Patricia toward the exit. The officers paused, holding the hysterical woman firmly in place. Patricia looked up at her daughter. Her mascara ruined her face, twisted into a mask of furious, humiliated desperation. "You planned this," Patricia hissed, her voice a ragged, breathless rasp. "You set us up. You ruined your own family, Savannah. You are a monster." Savannah looked at her mother. She saw the utter lack of remorse. She saw the deep, toxic entitlement that had defined Patricia's entire life. Savannah felt absolutely nothing. The last lingering shred of familial loyalty evaporated into the cold winter air. Savannah calmly reached her right hand deep into the front pocket of her dark denim jeans. Her fingers brushed against a crisp, folded piece of paper. It was the exact $50 bill Patricia had shoved into Savannah's hands at the International Airport Terminal 15 years ago. Savannah had kept it preserved, hidden in a lockbox, as a constant physical reminder of her mother's ultimate betrayal. She had promised herself she would return it when the time was right. Savannah pulled the folded bill from her pocket. She stepped forward, closing the final foot of distance between them. She reached out and deliberately tucked the crisp green bill deep into the front breast pocket of Patricia's ruin-soaked cashmere coat. "Buy yourself a cab ride home," Savannah whispered, her voice dropping to a low, chilling pitch that only her mother could hear. Patricia stared at her daughter, her eyes wide with sudden terrifying recognition. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The officers jerked her forward, hauling her out through the shattered front doors and into the freezing, blinding blizzard, dragging her toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. Savannah stood alone in the bright foyer, breathing in the cold, clean air of her newly reclaimed home. The flashing red and blue strobe lights of the 6 police cruisers bounced wildly against the thick snowbanks lining the driveway. Savannah stood near the shattered remnants of the mahogany front doors, watching the chaotic procession of her arrested relatives being shoved into the back seats of the squad cars. The heavy vehicle doors slammed shut in rapid succession. The engines revved loudly against the howling winter wind, and the procession of police vehicles began to slowly roll down the long, winding driveway, disappearing one by one into the blinding whiteout of the Christmas Eve blizzard. The deafening noise of the raid faded, leaving a sudden ringing silence in the grand foyer. The bitter cold continued to pour through the broken entryway, but Savannah did not shiver. She felt an immense radiating warmth spreading through her chest. Mr. Dalton stepped out from the shadows of the formal dining room. The sharp, impeccably dressed corporate attorney had remained completely out of sight during the initial breach, quietly observing the flawless execution of their legal trap. He walked across the marble floor carrying a pristine black leather briefcase. He stopped beside Savannah and adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking out at the snow-covered portico with an expression of profound professional satisfaction. Right behind him, Marcus Sterling signaled his cameraman to cut the live feed for a commercial break. The intense red recording light blinked off, giving the room a momentary visual reprieve. Suddenly, the crunch of heavy tires gripping the frozen gravel echoed up the driveway. A sleek, black luxury sedan swerved recklessly around the moving truck Brandon had abandoned in front of the house. The sedan skidded to a halt directly at the base of the marble steps, its high beams cutting through the falling snow and illuminating the shattered front entrance. Savannah, Chief Miller, and Mr. Dalton stood perfectly still watching the vehicle. The driver's side door swung open and Marcus Vance stepped out into the storm. The corrupt city notary wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit and a thin trench coat. He was clutching a heavy leather satchel against his chest, looking around the deserted driveway with a deeply confused expression. He had expected to find a bustling moving crew and a victorious billionaire ready to hand him a thick envelope of untraceable cash. Instead, he found empty, idling trucks and broken doors. Vance jogged up the marble steps, shivering violently and cursing the cold. He stepped right over the splintered wood and walked directly into the brilliantly lit grand foyer, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "Richard," he called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Richard, are you here? I brought the official seal just like we agreed." I need the rest of the 50 grand before I stamp the secondary municipal filings. You promised cash on delivery. Vance stopped dead in his tracks. He finally looked up and processed the scene in front of him. He did not see Richard Wilson holding a stack of $100 bills. He saw Chief Miller standing with his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He saw Savannah watching him with eyes like crushed ice. And he saw Marcus Sterling pointing a microphone directly at his face while the cameraman frantically powered the broadcast equipment back on. The color drained instantly from Vance's face. His jaw went entirely slack, and the heavy leather satchel slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with a loud, heavy thud. Chief Miller did not say a single word. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Two tactical officers who had remained behind to secure the property stepped out from the shadows of the sweeping staircase. They moved with terrifying speed, grabbing Vance by both arms and spinning him roughly around. Vance let out a high-pitched yelp of terror as they slammed him against the marble column, pulling his wrists sharply behind his back. The distinct metallic clicking of handcuffs echoed in the foyer for the final time that night. Marcus Vance, you are under arrest for felony forgery, bribery of a municipal official, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, Chief Miller recited, his voice booming with absolute authority. As the officers dragged the sobbing, hyperventilating notary toward a remaining patrol car, Mr. Dalton stepped directly into the center of the foyer. He placed his black leather briefcase flat on the ruined antique entry table the movers had abandoned. The attorney popped the brass latches and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. He turned toward Savannah, his expression transitioning from cold professionalism to genuine warmth. "It is officially over, Savannah," Mr. Dalton announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He held up the heavy blue folder for the cameras to capture. "This is an emergency injunction signed by a federal judge less than 3 hours ago. The quitclaim deed your father forged is legally voided, effective immediately. The holding companies he used to obscure the transaction have been frozen by the federal authorities. Your title to the Hawthorne estate has been fully restored, unassailable, and permanently free of any liens, claims, or disputes. This house is yours, completely and forever." Savannah reached out and touched the heavy blue folder. The physical proof of her total victory sent a surge of pure electricity through her veins. The nightmare was actually over. Marcus Sterling immediately sensed the dramatic climax of his career-defining broadcast. He stepped forward urgently, signaling his cameraman to push in tight for a close-up shot. Sterling thrust his microphone directly toward Savannah, his eyes wide with journalistic hunger. "Savannah Sterling," said, his voice vibrating with intense professional excitement, "the entire state is watching right now. Your family just orchestrated a massive criminal conspiracy to steal your fortune and break into your home on Christmas Eve. What do you have to say to them?" Savannah did not hesitate. She turned her head slowly and looked directly into the dark glass lens of the broadcast camera. She thought about her father's arrogance. She thought about her mother's endless cruelty. She thought about her sister's performative fake life and her brother-in-law's pathetic cowardice. "This house is for family," Savannah said, her voice perfectly even, carrying a deadly absolute calm. "And they do not belong here." The news segment aired continuously across the state the very next morning on Christmas Day. Families gathered around their televisions in living rooms, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, untouchable Wilson family was dragged out of a historic mansion in handcuffs. The broadcast played Chelsea's frantic, screaming Richard's arrogant confession and Patricia's ruined mascara on a continuous, agonizing loop. The elite social circles of the city immediately severed all ties. Country club memberships were revoked before noon. Board seats were vacated by emergency proxy. The Wilson name became instantly, irrevocably toxic. The wheels of justice moved with crushing, terrifying speed. 1 year later, the reality of their actions had settled into permanent, devastating consequence. Richard Wilson and Brandon sat side by side in a sterile, brightly lit visitation room of a federal penitentiary. They both wore identical, oversized orange jumpsuits. The heavy silver watches, the tailored cashmere coats, and the arrogant smirks were entirely gone. Richard had aged a decade in 12 months, his hair completely white, his face gaunt and hollow. He was serving a 15-year sentence for racketeering, tax evasion, and major real estate fraud. Brandon had received 8 years despite his desperate attempts to cooperate with the authorities. They spent their days scrubbing cafeteria floors and staring at cinderblock walls stripped of every single ounce of the power they once wielded. Patricia Wilson sat alone at a small, wobbly laminate table inside a cramped, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The heat was barely functioning, and she sat wrapped in a cheap acrylic blanket. The bankruptcy courts had seized everything: the luxury cars, the offshore accounts, the designer wardrobes. All of it was auctioned off to pay the massive federal fines. Patricia stared blankly at a stack of past-due utility bills. Tucked inside her worn, faded wallet was a single crisp $50 bill. She had never spent it. She kept it as a constant, suffocating reminder of the daughter she had thrown away and the empire she had lost. Chelsea was standing behind the fluorescent-lit counter of a discount retail store in a dying suburban mall. She wore an itchy polyester uniform polo shirt and a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. A group of her former high society friends walked past the store entrance carrying bags from high-end boutiques. They paused, pointing at Chelsea through the glass, whispering and laughing behind their hands. Chelsea ducked her head, her face burning with deep, agonizing humiliation, quickly turning away to fold a stack of clearance sweaters. Her phone no longer rang. Her followers had vanished. She was a complete social pariah, entirely erased from the world she had worshipped. Miles away, the winter wind howled softly through the tall, ancient pine trees surrounding the Hawthorne estate. But inside the mansion there was no cold, and there were no shadows. The shattered front doors had been replaced with massive reinforced solid oak, carved with intricate, beautiful details. The grand foyer was radiating with brilliant golden light. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of roasted meat, cinnamon, fresh pine, and baking pastries. In the formal dining room, a massive table had been extended to its absolute maximum length. A roaring fire crackled cheerfully in the massive stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the beautifully restored vintage wallpaper. The room was not filled with stuffy elite socialites or wealthy, arrogant investors. It was filled with loud, genuine, joyous laughter. Savannah sat at the head of the table. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, her dark hair falling perfectly over her shoulders. She looked radiant, completely at peace, and overflowing with genuine happiness. To her right sat Mr. Dalton, engaged in a booming, cheerful debate with Chief Miller, who had traded his tactical vest for a comfortable holiday sweater. To her left sat Marcus Sterling, laughing loudly as he shared a plate of appetizers with the brilliant private investigator who had spent months tracking Richard's offshore accounts. Filling out the rest of the massive table were the loyal, hard-working contractors, the electricians, the plumbers, and the local artisans who had stood by Savannah and helped her painstakingly restore the mansion to its original glory. This was her family. This was the circle she had chosen, a circle built on absolute loyalty, mutual respect, and genuine love. Savannah stood up from her chair, picking up a crystal flute filled with genuine vintage champagne. The room immediately quieted down, all eyes turning toward her with expressions of deep, profound respect. She looked down the length of the table, making eye contact with every single person who had fought beside her. She looked at the beautiful, historic home she had saved with her own 2 hands. The ghosts of her past had been completely, permanently eradicated. The coldness was gone. To family, Savannah said, her voice clear and ringing with absolute joy. The real kind. The guests raised their glasses in unison, their voices echoing warmly through the grand estate. Savannah took a slow, satisfying sip of the sweet, cold champagne. She lowered the glass, a brilliant, beautiful smile spreading across her face as the warmth of the firelight washed over her, completely erasing the darkness forever.